Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robert Litvak, the Wilson Center's Senior Vice President. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this event on the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, a 30-year legacy, organized jointly by the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the Central Intelligence Agency's Office of Public Affairs. We are extremely privileged to have Mariusz Kaminski, the Polish Minister Coordinator for Special Services, with us for a special keynote address. The Wilson Center's President and Director, Congresswoman Jane Harman, regrets that she cannot be here for Minister Kaminski's remarks, but asked me to express her personal gratitude for you coming a long way to speak to our audience today. We will also have the opportunity to hear from the former officers of the Central Intelligence Agency, individuals who monitored the fall of communism in 1989 and 1990 and were instrumental in formulating U.S. policy towards such momentous changes. I look forward to hearing their reflections in a moment. We will also have the opportunity to hear from a historian who studied the events of 1989-90 through the cutting-edge multinational archival research, and another scholar who has reflected deeply on the history and legacies of 1989 for Europe. The Wilson Center is particularly appropriate venue to host today's event, and I'm grateful that the Central Intelligence Agency approached us for this partnership. The Center's History and Public Policy Program has pioneered the use of history to analyze issues of current public policy interest, and using history as a tool of policy analysis is now central to the mission of the Wilson Center and our branding. To coincide with the discussion today, the CIA has declassified and published over 100 documents known as the National Intelligence Dailies, or NIDs. These documents represent a major source of information and insight for U.S. policymakers into what was happening in Eastern Europe, where it was heading, and what the implications were for the collapse of communist rule. I invite you to read the NIDs alongside other sources from the Wilson Center's digital archive. Over the years, we have published hundreds of documents about the events of 1989-90, drawn from the archives in the former Soviet Union, Germany, and other countries in Europe and around the world. Such sources have been translated into English and are freely accessible at digitalarchive.org. In closing, I would like to thank the History and Public Policy Program team, Christian Osterman, Charles Kraus, Peter Bierstecker, and Keon Byrne, and the CIA's Office of Public Affairs for working closely together to organize this stellar program. We look forward to future collaborations that bridge discussions of history and current-day policy challenges. I will now turn it over to Cynthia Didi Rapp, the CIA's Deputy Director for Analysis, to say a little more about our agenda today and to introduce our keynote speaker. Didi Rapp has served in her current position since January 2019 and is responsible for the quality of CIA's all-source assessments and for the professional development of the officers who create them. I'm told that her latest assignment is something of a homecoming after decades as an analyst and leader of analysts. Working primarily on the Middle East and Eurasia, Didi went on to become the CIA's Director of Public Affairs and Deputy Chief Operating Officer, among other senior posts. She served overseas as well. Deputy Director Rapp, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Litvak, and good morning, everyone. It is a privilege for me to represent the CIA at this event. I have the honor of leading the agency's analytic arm, which prepared the documents that have been declassified and shared today with you and the world at large. My husband, who's in the audience, and I were very much a part of that cadre that did this work. Through much of the 20th century, social and economic change were the result of violence and suffering, often on scales that defy easy description, let alone comprehension. In that context, among others, the events of 1989 are indeed exceptional. They generated countless indelible images and memories. For me and many others, some of the most dramatic came from Berlin. There, on a Cold War fault line, we saw the collapse of a system imposed from above by the Soviets, one that took extraordinary steps to prevent from fleeing those it claimed to represent and serve. And we saw the once virtually unthinkable become the rapidly unfolding. In Berlin, there was a palpable sense of excitement and expectation in the air. The protests in East Germany, most notably the weekly demonstrations in Leipzig that drew thousands, made clear the extent of disaffection and the demand for reform. On November 4th, there was a massive rally in Berlin at which those associated with the old regime, such as Markus Wolf, were actually booed. On the weekend after the wall came down, you could not miss the lines of East Germans queuing up for their Begrüßungsgeld, welcome money, lines that stretched out the doors of banks and ran for blocks down the streets. And at the Christmas markets that year, the atmosphere was positively euphoric as East and West Berliners celebrated together for the first time in decades. By that point, it was obvious that the genie had escaped the bottle of Soviet oppression, never to return. In fact, at least since the GDR's 40th anniversary, celebrations in October, if not well before, people suspected that the Soviets were not coming. Moscow had changed. There would not be another Berlin 1953, or Budapest 1956, or Prague 1968. By 1989, the Brezhnev doctrine was as dead as the man himself. Fear of the Soviets, and increasingly of their local friends, was basically gone. And there was a continuing example of Poland. In 1981, the government in Warsaw did crack down, but it could never extinguish the spirit of resistance. And when their time came in 1989, the Romanian people showed that they too were ready to resist brutality. Again and again, the drive for reform, for liberty, could not and would not be stopped. Using information of all kinds from across Europe and the Soviet Union, plus their own knowledge of the culture, histories, systems, and dynamics of the region, it was the job of CIA analysts to explain to our government what was going on and what that could mean for the future. And that is what you find in the material from CIA. It comes from the NID, which was at that time one of our flagship publications. It should be informative, but it is by no means exhaustive. And as you will probably hear from the panel, there was much going on in the way of providing analysis to policymakers. As you can readily imagine, the assessments produced by our officers, among others, took many forms, including briefings. So our goal here is to give you a sample of the analytic perspectives we were providing in remarkably fluid times, when old assumptions and new enthusiasms alike could lead us into error. Then as now, no matter how good our tradecraft might be, the sheer difficulty of intelligence analysis demands from those in the profession a healthy measure of humility, because we can never have all the information we need. But that should never hold us back from recognizing change, and we did not hold back. Before and during 1989, we saw how leaders can be surprised by processes they themselves set in motion or dynamics they themselves do not understand. Just think of Mikhail Gorbachev and Perestroika, or Günter Schabowski and his famous news conference on November 9th in Berlin that ultimately contributed to the fall of the wall. So these document releases, made with due respect for the protection of sources and methods, add to the historical record on which specialists and anyone who is interested can draw, not just in the United States, but in the countries about which we were writing. And of course, official papers alone cannot tell the full story of 1989, not even close. Because one quality that defines the period is the involvement of the public itself. Again and again, public pressure was a force for change in ways it had not been for years, decades, or perhaps ever. No matter the outcomes, some of which are still taking shape today, it is critical to listen to the voices of 1989, their lessons and their reflections. So I am glad that the program today features a panel that includes two of my former bosses and other colleagues who were at the heart of CIA's analytic effort in 1989. And naturally, of course, our keynote speaker. Mariusz Kaminski has been Minister Coordinator of the Special Services in Poland since 2015, and since August of this year, also Minister of the Interior and Administration. In those roles, he plays a crucial part of the defense of his own country and in its security relationship with many others, including most especially the United States. During his service in intelligence and politics, in the legislature and beyond, Minister Kaminski has stood against corruption, foreign interference, and the vestiges of Poland's post-Soviet dictatorship. These are not new causes for him. He lived through the hardship and injustices of communism, and he knows the efforts required to overthrow them. At the University of Warsaw in the 1980s, he was among the leaders of the push for freedom among Polish students. For that, he was arrested and detained. His very presence here reflects one of the greatest changes from that time. While no conflict or boundary could ever break the bonds of friendship between our two peoples, our two governments have gone from members of opposing alliances to close partners in a single alliance. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Minister Mariusz Kaminski.
Szanowni Państwo, dostojni goście, Panie i Panowie, serdecznie dziękuję organizatorom za zaproszenie i możliwość zabrania głosu podczas tak prestiżowego wydarzenia, a Wilson Center za gościnę. Chciałbym podkreślić, że dla przedstawiciela polskiego rządu obecność w tym miejscu ma znaczenie szczególne właśnie z uwagi na patronat tej instytucji.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, please let me extend my heartfelt gratitude to the organizers for inviting me to speak during such a prestigious event, and to the Wilson Center for hosting it. I would like to stress that addressing this gathering as a representative of the government of a sovereign Poland is of particular importance to me, precisely because of the patron of this great institution.
To prezydent Woodrow Wilson uczynił sprawę odbudowy niepodległego państwa polskiego jednym ze swoich priorytetów i filarów planu pokojowego dla Europy ponad 100 lat temu. Pamięć o wkładzie 28. prezydenta Stanów Zjednoczonych w przywrócenie mojej ojczyzny do rodziny wolnych narodów pozostaje w Polsce bardzo żywa.
It was President Woodrow Wilson who, more than a century ago, made it one of the pillars of his peace plan for Europe and the world to recreate an independent Polish state. the memory of the 28th President of the United States and his input into welcoming Poland into the family of free nations remains very vivid in my homeland.
Jednocześnie jako ktoś, kto doświadczył życia za żelazną kurtyną i widział zarówno terror tamtego systemu, jak i jego upadek, chciałbym wyrazić głębokie uznanie dla Wilson Center za wkład w utrwalanie pamięci i popularyzowanie wiedzy o okresie zimnej wojny.
At the same time, as someone who has lived behind the Iron Curtain and saw firsthand both the atrocities of the Soviet system and its ultimate downfall, I would like to commend the Wilson Center for its continued effort of keeping alive and raising the awareness of the realities of Cold War.
Z pewnością pomoże w tym decyzja o odtajnieniu szyfrogramów z lat 1989-90 ze stolic państw, które należały do Układu Warszawskiego. Dzięki uprzejmości organizatorów miałem okazję zapoznać się z niektórymi z tych depesz. To fascynująca lektura, która pozwala zrozumieć dynamikę jednego z najważniejszych procesów politycznych, gospodarczych i społecznych w historii współczesnego świata.
I am confident that the decision to declassify the cables sent from all capitals of the late Warsaw Pact between 1989 and 1990 will further help this cause. Thanks to the organizers, I had a chance to browse through some of these reports. All in all, they are invaluable in acknowledging the dynamics of one of the most important political, economic, and social processes in contemporary history.
Jeśli Państwo pozwolą, chciałbym podzielić się jednym z osobistych wspomnień z nieco wcześniejszego okresu, który poprzedzał jesień narodów w Europie Środkowo-Wschodniej. Jako młody człowiek angażowałem się wówczas w ruchy studenckie powstałe podczas Karnawału Solidarności. Jak Państwo wiedzą, na początku lat 80. komuniści postanowili zdelegalizować Solidarność, ale nie udało im się złamać naszego ducha, kontynuowaliśmy więc działalność w podziemiu. W drugiej połowie lat 80., kiedy Związek Sowiecki grząsł w Afganistanie, postanowiliśmy dołożyć naszą małą cegiełkę.
If you allow me, I would like to share one personal memory that predated the autumn of the nations in Central Eastern Europe. As a young man, I was engaged in a student movement born during the so-called Carnival of Solidarity. As you know, in the early 1980s, the communists decided to outlaw solidarity, but they never succeeded in breaking our spirit. We went underground. In the second half of the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was back down in Afghanistan, we decided to chip in too.
W okolicach Warszawy stacjonowała wówczas jednostka Armii Czerwonej. W nocy na murach okalających tę jednostkę malowaliśmy czerwoną farbą Sowieci do domu. Chcieliśmy w symboliczny sposób pokazać, że czujemy się częścią globalnego ruchu oporu przeciwko Sowietom i że to, co się dzieje w górach Hindukuszu, ściśle wiąże się z sytuacją w Polsce i na odwrót.
Back then, a Red Army unit was stationed just outside of Warsaw. During the night, we would paint Soviets go home on the brick wall surrounding their barracks. The paint, as you might suspect, was red. That was our symbolic gesture and contribution to the global resistance to the Soviet rule, as well as recognition that what went on in the mountains and valleys of the Hindu Kush mattered for what was going on in Poland, and vice versa.
Ostatecznie wojska sowieckie opuściły Polskę w 1993 roku. Dzisiaj w tej samej jednostce pod Warszawą stacjonują siły zbrojne niepodległej Polski, a konkretnie jedna z naszych elitarnych jednostek sił specjalnych. Żołnierze tej jednostki brali udział w operacjach u boku swoich amerykańskich towarzyszy broni na Haiti, w Afganistanie, w Iraku. Pół żartem, pół serio mówiąc, jest to pierwsza jednostka polskich sił zbrojnych, która przystąpiła do NATO. To swego rodzaju ironia historii.
Ultimately, the Red Army left Poland in 1993. Today, this facility, these barracks, are home to the armed forces of an independent Poland. More specifically, one of the units of our elite special forces. These soldiers participated in operations in Haiti, Afghanistan, Iraq, and many more, alongside their American brothers in arms. Half-jokingly, we like to say that it was the first unit to enter NATO. This is how ironic history can be.
Szanowni Państwo, jeśli o historii mowa, to mijający 2019 rok jest rokiem wielu rocznic. 30-lecie bankructwa systemu komunistycznego w Europie Środkowo-Wschodniej to jedna z tych cezur. To rocznica napawająca optymizmem, bo przypomina, że pomimo przeciwności dobro zatriumfuje ostatecznie nad złem.
Speaking of history, 2019 is a year of many anniversaries. The 30th anniversary of the fall of the communist system in Central Eastern Europe is one of them. And it is an optimistic one, because it reminds us that, despite adversities, good will triumph over evil.
We wrześniu tego roku wspólnie z przywódcami i mężami stanów z kilkudziesięciu państw obchodziliśmy w Warszawie 70. rocznicę wybuchu II wojny światowej, najstraszliwszego konfliktu w dziejach, który zaczął się od napaści nazistowskich Niemiec i sowieckiej Rosji na Polskę.
Last September in Warsaw, together with leaders and statesmen from several dozen countries, we commemorated the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II, the most destructive and harrowing conflict in the history of humankind, which began with the coordinated invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia.
To rocznica ku przestrodze, memento, do czego może doprowadzić zmowa dwóch ideologii totalitarnych, które ze swej definicji są wrogie wolności, demokracji i prawu suwerennych narodów do decydowania o swoim losie. Polska i cała Europa Środkowo-Wschodnia żyła pod jarzmem obu totalitaryzmów łącznie pół wieku. Nasz rozwój, nasze ambicje były podporządkowane utopijnym ideom obcym naszej kulturze i tradycji.
This is a memento to what can result from an alliance of two totalitarian ideologies, who by definition are hostile to freedom, democracy, and the right of sovereign nations to decide their fate on their own. In total, Poland and the whole region of Central Eastern Europe lived under the yoke of these totalitarian regimes for half a century. Our development, our ambitions, were just an afterthought to those whose ideas were inimical to our culture and our traditions.
Jest wreszcie trzecia wielka rocznica, która przypada w tym roku i której nie sposób pominąć w tym miejscu. To stulecie nawiązania relacji dyplomatycznych między Polską a Stanami Zjednoczonymi Ameryki. To rocznica, z której można czerpać inspirację.
Then there is the third great anniversary, one that cannot be omitted here. It is the centennial of establishing the diplomatic relations between Poland and the United States. It is an anniversary that inspires.
Proszę tylko pamiętać, że przez połowę tego stulecia te relacje w wymiarze oficjalnym, czyli politycznym i gospodarczym, znajdowały się w najlepszym razie w stanie uśpienia, kiedy Polska znajdowała się pod okupacją niemiecką, a nierzadko wręcz wrogości, po tym jak zostaliśmy siłą wcieleni do obozu sowieckiego. Jeśli wbrew tym przeciwnościom udało nam się podnieść je w minionych 3 dekadach na obecny, bezprecedensowo wysoki poziom, to stało się tak dlatego, że przetrwała wspólnota wartości, które są nam bliskie.
Just think about it. For half of the past century, these relations, in their official, political, and economic dimension, were in a state of hibernation when Poland was under the German occupation, or of outright enmity after Poland was forced into the Soviet bloc. The reason why the Polish-US relations could have been raised to the current unprecedentedly high level was because the community of values that are dear to us endured.
Dla Polaków wartością nadrzędną zawsze była wolność. Solidarność, ogromny, wielomilionowy ruch społeczny narodził się w Polsce, ponieważ tak silny tam był duch wolności i tradycji walki o niepodległość.
For Poles, freedom has always been of extraordinary importance. Solidarity, a massive, multi-million strong civic movement, could have been born in Poland precisely because of the strength of the spirit of freedom and the traditions of the struggle for independence.
Jednym z najważniejszych depozytariuszy polskiego ducha wolności był Kościół katolicki. Nie tylko nie uległ brutalnym prześladowaniom ze strony reżimu komunistycznego, ale przewodził w walce z nim. To dlatego tak ogromne znaczenie dla całego wolnego świata miał wybór Polaka na godność papieską. Jan Paweł II był liderem duchowym, ale wówczas duchowość była równoznaczna z politycznością. Chodziło bowiem o realną, namacalną próbę sił między dobrem a złem.
The Catholic Church has always been one of the most important depositaries of the Polish spirit of freedom. Not only has it not succumbed to the pressure and brutal persecutions by the communists, but it led the fight to resist it. This is why electing a Pole to lead the Catholic Church was of such a great significance for the whole free world. Pope John Paul II was a spiritual leader, but spirituality had a very political edge to it. It was a very real, tangible struggle between good and evil.
Komuniści doskonale zdawali sobie sprawę z autorytetu, jakim cieszył się Kościół w Polsce. Za wszelką cenę chcieli więc go zmusić do milczenia albo prześladowaniami, albo próbami przekupienia i uwikłania w swoją grę o utrzymanie władzy. To dlatego, na co wskazywały meldunki amerykańskiego wywiadu z Warszawy z wiosny 1989 roku, komuniści zdecydowali się na nadanie Kościołowi przywilejów majątkowych i uznanie jego częściowej autonomii. Zdecydowali się na to jedynie z wyrachowania. Liczyli, że Kościół, chcąc bronić swoich interesów, nie będzie podważał ich władzy.
Communists knew well just how much following the church had in Poland. They did their utmost to force it into silence, either with persecution or with attempts to corrupt it and implicate it in their power struggle. That was the reasoning behind the decision to grant the church economic privileges and limited autonomy. The US intelligence, as evidenced by cables from the spring of 1989, rightly took notice of these developments. Make no mistake, the communists did it out of cynicism. They were hoping that the church, fearful of its own interests, would not dare undermine the communist rule.
Polski duch wolności dał więc nam siłę wewnętrzną, ale był też czynnik zewnętrzny, który przyczynił się do tego, że dziś zabieram przed państwem głos jako przedstawiciel suwerennej, demokratycznej, dynamicznie rozwijającej się Polski. To amerykańskie przywództwo, leadership, gotowość do działania oraz wizja zaangażowania w sprawy tej części świata do odgrywania roli europejskiego mocarstwa.
And so, the Polish spirit of freedom granted us with inner strength. But there was an external factor at play as well, one that no doubt contributed to the fact that I am speaking to you today as a representative of a sovereign, democratic, economically vibrant Poland. It was US leadership, the readiness to act, accompanied by a vision to engage in Central European affairs and to play the role of a European power.
Dobrze pamiętam, jaką popularnością cieszył się w Polsce prezydent Ronald Reagan. Mieliśmy poczucie, że w Białym Domu mamy sojusznika, który doskonale zdaje sobie sprawę ze stawki wydarzeń w Polsce i w całym regionie.
I can recall just how popular Ronald Reagan was in Poland. We were convinced that we had a powerful ally in the White House, one that understood what was at stake in Poland and in the region as a whole.
Polska odzyskała niepodległość po niemal 50 latach sowieckiego zniewolenia dzięki moralnej sile naszej Solidarności, duchowemu przywództwu naszego papieża Jana Pawła II oraz politycznej sile i odwadze naszego prezydenta Ronalda Reagana.
Poland was able to regain independence after nearly 5 decades of Soviet domination because of the moral strength of our solidarity, the spiritual leadership of our Pope John Paul II, and the courage and political strength of our president. Let me repeat this, our president, Ronald Reagan.
Bez amerykańskiego leadershipu nie byłoby zatem odrodzonej Rzeczpospolitej po I wojnie światowej, obalenia komunizmu, a wreszcie sukcesu przemian wolnorynkowych w Polsce i w innych państwach Europy Środkowo-Wschodniej po 1989 roku. Przywództwa, co chcielibyśmy z satysfakcją podkreślić, które przejawiały amerykańskie administracje bez względu na afiliacje polityczne. Wizję, którą sformułował zmarły w ubiegłym roku prezydent George Bush senior, wdrażał jego następca z Partii Demokratycznej Bill Clinton, a następnie kolejni prezydenci przy wydatnym wsparciu Kongresu.
Without US leadership, there would not have been a reborn Poland after World War I. The communism would not have fallen, and the nations of Central Eastern Europe would not have succeeded in implementing sweeping free market reforms after 1989. I would like to underline that it was the leadership that was on display no matter what the political affiliation of the administrations in power. The vision of the late President George H.W. Bush was implemented by his successor Bill Clinton, and then by all presidents that followed, with no small support and involvement from the US Congress.
Wizja plus ponadpartyjny konsensus. Oto przepis na skuteczne amerykańskie przywództwo na rzecz dobra. Konsensus ten był trwalszy niż dyktowałaby to logika kadencyjności, na której opierają swoje funkcjonowanie państwa demokratyczne. Jest to lekcja na przyszłość. Wtedy, kiedy stawką jest bezpieczeństwo demokracji, suwerenność naszych państw, nie możemy pozwolić na zerwanie ciągłości naszych działań, na uczynienie tego tematu przedmiotem politycznego sporu.
Vision plus bipartisan support. This is a recipe for effective US leadership for good in world affairs. This consensus proved to be stronger than dictated by the logic of power alternation, itself a cornerstone of the democratic systems. This is a lesson to draw upon in future. Whenever what is at stake is the security of democracy, the sovereignty of our states, we cannot afford to compromise the continuity of our effort and to allow it to become a victim of the political tug of war.
W Polsce znamy więc wagę amerykańskiego zaangażowania i wiemy, do czego może prowadzić amerykańska bezczynność. Uważamy, że modna dziś w niektórych stolicach europejskich koncepcja autonomii strategicznej Europy, o ile miałaby oznaczać rozluźnienie więzi transatlantyckich i osłabienie roli Ameryki jako europejskiego mocarstwa, nie ma przyszłości.
And so, Poland knows what is the real significance of US engagement and what can be the price of US disengagement. We believe that the idea of Europe's strategic autonomy that has been gaining in popularity in some European capitals, if it were to lead to the loosening of the transatlantic links and weakening of America's standing as a European power, has no future.
Z pewnością jednak taki scenariusz zadowoliłby państwo, które z własnej woli i wskutek prowadzonej przez siebie agresywnej polityki odgrodziło się od Zachodu, czyli putinowskiej Rosji. Na Kremlu wciąż żywe jest myślenie rodem z poprzedniej epoki. Ludziom, którzy odpowiadają za wojnę na Ukrainie i za pełzającą agresję przeciwko Zachodowi, marzy się o tworzenie porządku międzynarodowego, w tym europejskiego, opartego na strefach wpływów, równowadze sił, w którym prawa i interesy mniejszych narodów są podporządkowane interesom wielkich mocarstw.
Of course, such a scenario would certainly be welcomed by a country which voluntarily and because of its own aggressive policies has turned its back on the West. Vladimir Putin's Russia. The Kremlin keeps catering to all thinking. People who are responsible for waging a shooting war against Ukraine and a creeping aggression against the West dream about reinstating an international order in Europe that would be based on the spheres of influence and balance of power, where the rights and interests of smaller nations are taking a back seat against the interests of great powers.
Jednocześnie dostrzegam zasadniczą różnicę między Związkiem Sowieckim a współczesną Rosją. W Związku Sowieckim kręgosłup zbrodniczego systemu stanowiła partia komunistyczna. Jej narzędziem była Armia Czerwona i oczywiście służby specjalne. Miały one wprowadzać międzynarodową ekspansję komunizmu. Były jednak podporządkowane partii.
At the same time, there is a fundamental difference between the Soviet Union and present-day Russia. In the Soviet Union, the Communist Party was the backbone of a brutal, murderous system. The Red Army and secret services served as instruments to support the international expansion of communism. They were subordinate to the party.
Związek Sowiecki, państwo większe i terytorialnie i pod względem ludnościowym niż obecna Rosja, utrzymywał niemal 500 000 funkcjonariuszy służb specjalnych, cywilnych i wojskowych. W służbach specjalnych putinowskiej Rosji pracuje niemal 400 000 ludzi, a tamtejsze władze wiele inwestują w dalszy ich rozwój.
In the Soviet Union, a country whose territory and demographic potential was greater than that of Russia today, the total number of operatives of the secret services, military and civilian, stood at almost 500,000. Putin's Russia employs some 400,000 operatives and keeps investing in their capabilities.
W dzisiejszej Rosji to służby specjalne są kręgosłupem i spoiwem państwa. To one decydują o tym, kto należy do elity politycznej i gospodarczej, a kto z niej wypadnie. Nie kierują się żadną ideologią, nie roszczą sobie pretensji do reprezentowania rzekomych wartości. Ten nihilizm jest im na rękę, bo pomaga utrzymywać apatię społeczeństwa i zapewniać stabilność systemu. Służby nie są też zainteresowane wyeliminowaniem korupcji czy odejściem od modelu gospodarki surowcowej.
In today's Russia, the secret services are the backbone. They decide who belongs to the political and economic elite and who does not. They are not driven by any ideology. They do not pretend to stand for any values. They find this nihilism useful because it helps to prolong the apathy of the society and ensure the stability of the system. Similarly, they are not interested in eliminating corruption or abandoning the current economic model that relies heavily on extraction of mineral resources.
Jeżeli więc ktokolwiek decyduje się robić z taką Rosją interesy polityczne lub gospodarcze, w rzeczywistości robi interesy z jej aparatem bezpieczeństwa, a on nie ma nad sobą żadnej kontroli ani nie uznaje żadnej zwierzchności.
And so, if anyone decides to engage with Russia politically or economically, they are in fact doing business with the Russian security apparatus. It answers to no one. It has no authority higher than itself.
Raz na jakiś czas funkcjonariusze tych służb pokazują światu swoją prawdziwą twarz. Spektakularne zabójstwo Aleksandra Litwinienki, próba zabicia Siergieja Skripala i jego córki, akcje sabotażowe na Ukrainie, czy próba zamachu stanu w Czarnogórze. Oto kilka przykładów z ostatnich lat pokazujących, z kim mamy do czynienia. Putinowskie FSB jest prostą kontynuacją zbrodniczego sowieckiego KGB. Te same metody działania, ta sama mentalność. Ich oczywistym celem jest polityczna odbudowa Związku Sowieckiego jako światowego imperium. Dlatego widzimy ich w Syrii i w Wenezueli, w Afryce Północnej i na Kaukazie i na Bałkanach.
Every once in a while, the operatives of this apparatus show their true colors. The gruesome murder of Alexander Litvinenko, the assassination attempt of Sergei Skripal and his daughter, acts of sabotage against Ukraine, or the failed coup in Montenegro. This is just a sample of the actions of the adversary we are dealing with. Putin's FSB is an heir to the murderous Soviet KGB. Same action kit, same mentality. Their goal is clearly the restoration of the Soviet Union as an empire. This is the purpose of their activities in Syria, Venezuela, North Africa, but also in the Caucasus and the Balkans.
Dla takiej Rosji Zachód jest wrogiem. Rosja chce wyparcia Stanów Zjednoczonych z Europy oraz wewnętrznego zdezorganizowania i osłabienia państw europejskich po to, aby utrudnić oddziaływanie naszych instytucji i naszych zasad oraz wartości, zarówno na samą Rosję, jak i na państwa w jej najbliższym sąsiedztwie.
For this Russia, the West is an enemy. Russia seeks to punish the United States out of Europe and to destabilize European states in order to neutralize the political influence of our institutions and our values and norms, both vis-à-vis Russia and the countries in its vicinity.
Elita kremlowska obawia się tego oddziaływania, ponieważ sama nie ma do zaoferowania atrakcyjnej dla własnego społeczeństwa alternatywy. Nie podejmuje więc rywalizacji na modele rozwoju. Dlatego mrzonkami są plany selektywnego zaangażowania Rosji czy budowania z nią agendy zaufania i bezpieczeństwa. Podstawą myślenia Rosji o relacjach z Zachodem jest brak zaufania i strach. To zaś rodzi agresję.
The Kremlin elite dreads this influence because it has nothing attractive to offer in return to the Russian society. It will never dare to compete with other models of development. Plans of selective engagement with Russia or an agenda for trust and security with it are therefore nothing more than pipe dreams. The cornerstone of Russian approach to relations with the West is fear and a profound lack of trust. This, in turn, leads to aggression.
Agresja ta najwcześniej przejawia się w warstwie informacyjnej. Oczywiście Rosja nie wynalazła propagandy. Zręcznie posługuje się jednak narzędziami, na których bazują tzw. społeczeństwa informacyjne. W ten sposób buduje swoją przewagę. W wojnie hybrydowej Rosjanie bezwzględnie wykorzystują internet, media społecznościowe, fora dyskusyjne, wdrażają strategię dedykowanej dezinformacji przeznaczonej dla wybranych grup.
In its initial form, this aggression is visible in the information dimension. Of course, Russia has not invented propaganda, but it is skillful at using it to its advantage, the tools from which our societies draw their strength. The internet, social media, discussion forums are all front and center of Russia's hybrid warfare. Russians implement strategies of so-called dedicated disinformation, targeting groups of their choice.
Nowe technologie oraz pluralistyczny charakter świata zachodniego, jego otwartość na debatę dają Rosji możliwość do skuteczniejszego niż dawniej zatruwania dyskursu i sterowania nim w sposób, który dzieli Zachód.
Modern technologies and open, pluralistic nature of Western societies allow Russia to effectively poison the discourse and manage it in a way that sows discord in the West.
Rosja straszy rzekomą agresywną polityką NATO i militaryzacją krajów bałtyckich, tak jak w latach 70. i 80. XX wieku inspirowała ruchy sprzeciwiające się rozmieszczaniu amerykańskich rakiet średniego zasięgu w Europie Zachodniej. Wspiera poprzez kontrolowane przez siebie media i aparat dezinformacji ruchy protestacyjne czy separatystyczne. Wspiera wreszcie środowiska politycznych radykałów, szerzących w przestrzeni publicznej hasła nienawiści na tle narodowościowym czy rasowym.
Russia blames NATO for allegedly pursuing an aggressive policy of militarization of the Baltic states, much like the Soviet Union animated and supported the initiatives to station US intermediate-range missiles in Western Europe. Russia supports protest movements and separatists across Europe, relying on its increasingly capable disinformation apparatus. Finally, it grants support to political radicals who publicly peddle in racial and ethnic hatred.
Putinowska Rosja wie, jak penetrować zachodnie z natury otwarte i inkluzywne instytucje polityczne i społeczne, bo ma w tym sięgające zimnej wojny gigantyczne doświadczenie.
Putin's Russia knows exactly how to penetrate our open, inclusive political and civic institutions, because it can draw upon decades of experience accumulated during the Cold War.
Bez skrupułów korumpuje nasze elity biznesowe, wykorzystując jeden ze swoich nielicznych atutów – dostęp do bogactw naturalnych, przede wszystkim energetycznych. Rosja nie musi sama zabiegać na przykład o poluzowanie reżimu sankcyjnego ustanowionego wskutek jej agresji przeciwko Ukrainie, czy w rezultacie działania jej służb specjalnych na terytorium państw NATO. Robią to w jej imieniu przedstawiciele europejskich elit, starając się dowieść, że sankcje są nieskuteczne, bo nie zmieniły rosyjskiego postępowania.
It shamelessly corrupts our business elites with one of its rare trump cards, access to natural resources, energy resources in particular. Russia does not have to single-handedly lobby for loosening the sanctions regime put in place in response to Russian aggression against Ukraine or Russian secret services operations on NATO territory. Russia can count on the representatives of the European elites who are tirelessly arguing that sanctions are not working because they have not changed Russian behavior.
To, co jednak jest najgroźniejsze w działaniach Rosjan, to odnotowywane w szeregu państwach Zachodu próby wpływania na przebieg demokratycznych wyborów. Ingerowanie w wolne wybory naszych obywateli jest uderzeniem w fundamenty niepodległości naszych państw i narodów. Tego typu agresja polityczna Rosjan musi się spotkać z naszą zdecydowaną i adekwatną reakcją. Brak odpowiedzi w takich sytuacjach rozzuchwala Rosjan i zachęca ich do dalszych działań.
However, what I find most worrisome and dangerous about Russian conduct are the instances of attempted interference in the democratic process of a number of countries in the West, meddling with the rights of our citizens to make free, independent political choices is a strike at the heart of our nation's independence. Such aggression must be met with a firm, appropriate reaction. Letting such actions go unchecked will only embolden the Russians to redouble their efforts.
Panie i panowie, powiedziałem wiele dobrego na temat amerykańskiego przywództwa i jego sukcesów, ale dzieło, które rozpoczęło się 30 lat temu, nie jest skończone. Dla wielu narodów walka o wolność wciąż trwa i potrzebują one naszego wsparcia i naszej siły, zarówno duchowej, jak i materialnej. Białoruś, Gruzja, Mołdawia, Ukraina i inne państwa powstałe na gruzach Związku Sowieckiego zasługują na ten sam sukces, który stał się udziałem Polski, państw bałtyckich, Czech, Słowacji, Węgier, Rumunii i innych państw przyjętych do NATO i Unii Europejskiej w ostatnich latach.
Ladies and gentlemen, I said a lot of positive words about US leadership and its accomplishments, but the work that started 30 years ago is yet to be finished. For many nations, the struggle for freedom continues. They need our support and our strength, moral and material alike. Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, and other countries born after the collapse of the Soviet Union deserve to experience the same success that was achieved by Poland, the Baltic states, Czech Republic, Slovakia, as well as other countries that joined NATO and the European Union over the past years.
Wczoraj wieczorem podczas spaceru po Waszyngtonie przechodziłem obok pomnika upamiętniającego weteranów wojny koreańskiej. Moją uwagę zwrócił napis "Freedom is not free". Winni jesteśmy szacunek tym, którzy oddali życie za wolność, ale równie istotne jest, aby pamiętać, że wolność nie jest dana raz na zawsze, że trzeba się o nią bić.
Yesterday evening, during a walk here in Washington, D.C., I passed the Korea War Memorial. I noticed the motto on the wall, "Freedom is not free." We owe respect to those who gave their lives for freedom, but it is equally important to remember that freedom is not given to us once and for all. Instead, taking it for granted, we must fight for it.
Ze swej strony deklaruję wsparcie dla tej walki, ramię w ramię z naszymi sojusznikami i partnerami. Dla Polski trwałość i bezpieczeństwo, rozwój wspólnoty euroatlantyckiej mają zasadnicze znaczenie, ponieważ w tym upatrujemy najsilniejszej gwarancji naszej wolności i suwerenności. Dziękuję za uwagę.
For my part, I am ready to be part of this struggle, shoulder to shoulder with our allies and partners. For Poland, the durability, security, and further development of the Euro-Atlantic community are of profound importance. In it, we see the strongest possible foundation of our freedom and sovereignty. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Minister Kaminski. The minister has agreed to take a few questions. His time is he has to shortly leave, but I think we can fit in a few questions from the audience. If you could please raise your hand and wait for the microphone and identify yourself before speaking. Questions, comments? Mark. Up front. Hold on, microphone.
Mark Kramer from Harvard. The question I have pertains to Russia. One of the legacies, as you mentioned, of 1989 is that Russia, particularly the FSB and the intelligence services, continued mostly unformed. Do you think that there was a chance for Russia actually also to become a democratic country, particularly if the KGB, as the FSB was, had been dismantled?
So the question, pytanie jest, czy po 1989 roku FSB i serwisy rosyjskie nadal operują tak jak KGB. Czy pan myśli, że jak one tak będą nadal operować, czy Rosja ma szansę zostać państwem demokratycznym, czy jest potrzebne, aby najpierw te serwisy były zdemontowane?
Szanowni Państwo, oczywiście, że cały czas po roku 1989, kiedy zyskaliśmy niepodległość, czujemy się pod presją Rosji, czujemy się pod presją rosyjskich służb specjalnych. Prowadzimy aktywne działania kontrwywiadowcze, żeby pacyfikować te wpływy. Natomiast niewątpliwie jesteśmy, tak jak szereg państw europejskich, przez Rosjan atakowani w różny, brutalny i perfidny sposób. Również w Polsce monitorujemy i widzimy próby wpływania na nasze wewnętrzne życie polityczne.
We continue to see that the FSB continues its operations. We continually struggle to counteract them both in counterintelligence and monitoring their activities, not just in Europe, but especially in Poland, since they're active throughout the region.
To, co chciałem w swoim wystąpieniu Państwu przekazać, że o ile w czasach komunizmu ten kręgosłup państwa totalitarnego stanowiła partia komunistyczna, która miała swoje instrumenty w postaci Czerwonej Armii i służb specjalnych takich jak KGB, to teraz obecna Rosja, putinowska Rosja, której personifikacją, twarzą jest były agent KGB Władimir Putin, tak naprawdę kręgosłupem tego państwa są służby specjalne. To one sterują życiem politycznym, życiem gospodarczym Rosji.
Primarily because Putin is a former KGB operative, and similarly too, there's a link between him and the way that the current system operates, whereas under communist rule, KGB was the backbone of the system. It really ran everything. The operation of the country was dependent upon the KGB. Similarly to now, Putin and his connection and his legacy of KGB experience, and translation of it into the FSB is FSB and the security services are essential to the way that the country operates.
Dlatego też, kiedy myślimy o relacjach z Rosją, musimy pamiętać, jaki to jest przeciwnik, bo oni sami określają się jako przeciwnik świata zachodniego. To jest przeciwnik zorganizowany w państwo kierowane przez służby specjalne. Stąd autorytaryzm Rosji, stąd też metody działania, które są dla nas nieakceptowalne. I nie ma możliwości, że zmieni się Rosja w państwo demokratyczne, kiedy u steru będą służby specjalne.
So it must be remembered that they continue to be our opponents. Their existence, Russia's existence, and Putin himself is directly in opposition to the West and to democratic values. And the fact that the security services are so deeply involved in directing the country itself, their methods are simply unacceptable to democratically minded countries, and therefore, for as long as they exist, it is that they are simply incapable of becoming a democratic nation that is acceptable to the West.
Chcę też zwrócić Państwu uwagę, że w Rosji nie ma wolnego rynku. Gospodarka rosyjska nie jest gospodarką wolnorynkową, ale gospodarką oligarchiczną, sterowaną przez służby specjalne. Wielcy oligarchowie rosyjscy nie zdobywają wielkich pieniędzy, dlatego że są kreatywni, zdolni, dlatego że mają pomysły gospodarcze. Oni są sankcjonowani przez reżim, który pozwala im robić interesy i z którym owocami gospodarczymi się dzielą.
We also must remember that Russia is not a free market. It is directed by an oligarch class, which itself is connected to special services, and this system is sanctioned by the regime itself.
to Putin i służby rosyjskie specjalne określają tego, kto może zrobić karierę w życiu gospodarczym. A jeżeli ktoś urywa się z tego łańcucha służb specjalnych, kończy tak jak Chodorkowski.
It's Putin who decides who can make a career in this kind of system. They are on the leash held by Putin himself, and those who try to break off the leash end up like Khodorkovsky.
Chodorkowski. Potężna firma o zasięgu międzynarodowym z dnia na dzień przestaje istnieć, a jej właściciel trafia do łagru.
And then once it gets pushed off, the owner of a firm ends up in a prison camp, labor camp.
Thank you. Other questions? All the way in the back, yes.
Andrei Larionov, Cato Institute. Would you be able to comment on the position of the current Polish government toward the Smolensk crash in year 2010?
Czy może pan skomentować pozycję polskiego rządu na wypadek w Smoleńsku?
Wypadek w Smoleńsku był wielką ogólnonarodową tragedią w Polsce. Zginął prezydent i około 100 przedstawicieli polskiej elity politycznej, kulturalnej i duchowej.
The Smolensk accident, the crash was a great tragedy in Poland, at which the president of the republic died, as well as 100 members of the Polish political elite.
Śledztwo, które jest prowadzone od lat, nie przynosi żadnych efektów, a współpraca z władzami rosyjskimi w tym zakresie jest żadna. Czujemy się zakładnikami, symbolicznie mówiąc, wraku samolotu, który rozbił się pod Smoleńskiem z naszym prezydentem.
The investigation has not really gone far enough, and we are prevented by the Russians to fully get answers on what happened, and we feel as though we are hostages of the Russians.
Rosja perfidnie gra Smoleńskiem, gra wrakiem smoleńskiego samolotu, wiedząc, jak wielkie, ogromne emocje wzbudza ten temat w Polsce. Zginęło naprawdę wielu wybitnych Polaków, polskich generałów, polityków, duchownych, ludzi kultury. To była straszna tragedia i ból w polskich sercach dalej jest i trwa.
Russia is perfidiously using this tragedy to play on emotions in the Polish public, which remembers that among the victims were many generals, politicians, and important cultural figures, and this continued abuse by Russia of this event it just exaggerates the tragedy.
Być może nigdy nie dowiemy się, jaka była przyczyna tej tragedii, jaka była przyczyna śmierci tylu wybitnych Polaków.
As a result, we may never know what was the cause of this crash, and what was the cause of the death of so many great Poles.
Thank you. Ross?
Ross Johnson, Wilson Center. Mr. Kaminski, much of the public discussion about Russian activities focuses on the GRU and the Internet Research Agency and so on. How do you see the division of labor between GRU, SVR, and FSB when it comes to this kind of Russian aggressive activity?
Dużo publicznego dyskusji o rosyjskiej inwigilacji, o rosyjskich tych prób w elekcji wyborów amerykańskich w 2016 roku jest oparte na tym, że GRU, FSB i inne serwisy miały w tym rolę. Jak pan widzi, jak oni sobie zrównowały swoją pracę, jakie mieli odpowiedzialności pomiędzy tymi trzema grupami GRU, SWR i FSB?
Oczywiście nie dysponuję tak szczegółową wiedzą. Mam nadzieję, że nasi przyjaciele z CIA mają głębszą wiedzę. Ja nie chcę odnosić się do wyborów amerykańskich i jestem przekonany, że Rosjanom nie udało się wpłynąć skutecznie na przebieg wyborów, ale to, że usiłowali wpływać na przebieg wyborów w Stanach Zjednoczonych, w wielu krajach europejskich, pokazuje, jak perfidną politykę prowadzą Rosjanie i ich służby specjalne. Także nie chciałbym tu się odnosić bezpośrednio do wyborów w konkretnych krajach. Jestem przekonany, że celu nie osiągnęli, ale musimy. To pokazują logika wydarzeń. W szeregu krajach europejskich próbują to robić, próbują wspierać siły prorosyjskie, tak żeby one przejmowały władzę w tych krajach. To jest uderzenie w serce demokracji. Na to nie możemy pozwolić. Musimy się przed każdymi wyborami przygotowywać do tego, że będą ingerować, będą próbować. Może bezskutecznie, ale będą próbować. Nie wysyłają czołgów, wysyłają agentów, wysyłają pieniądze, finansują w sposób nietransparentny niektóre ugrupowania polityczne. Tego musimy pilnować w całej Europie, w całym świecie zachodu.
Okay, dobra.
The Russian services are continually working to subvert and meddle in abroad. The logic of events in different countries shows us they are at the heart of they strike at the heart of democracy, and it is crucial and very important that we prepare for each time, for every eventuality when in order to protect our democratic systems. I jeszcze co było jest pytanie, że bardziej specyficznie pan się pytał, jak oni sobie te trzy serwisy, jak oni sobie pracę dają, ile każda z tych trzech grup robi, jaki jest balans pracy pomiędzy nimi.
Niewątpliwie ostatnie wydarzenia pokazują, że niezwykle aktywny, niezwykle agresywny jest GRU, rosyjski wywiad wojskowy. To oni wykonują wyroki śmierci na swoich obywatelach, którzy w ich zdaniem zdradzili Rosję, działając na terenie zachodniej Europy. Myślę tu o przykładach brytyjskich, o ostatnim zabójstwie w Berlinie obywatela Gruzji pochodzenia czeczeńskiego. No to są rzeczy niebywałe, czy o ich ingerencji w Czarnogórze, kiedy usiłowali dokonać zamachu stanu. To są ludzie GRU, wywiadu rosyjskiego wojskowego. Niezwykle bezwzględni mordercy, ale zwróćcie też Państwo uwagę, że mimo ich determinacji, pokazującej ich mentalność, ich nastawienie, etos tej służby, w wielu wypadkach są nieskuteczni, są nieporadni. Chociażby sprawa Skripala jest wielką kompromitacją tej służby specjalnej.
So he believes that the GRU is actually the most involved, and they are the most brutal. They're the ones tasked with carrying out death sentences, as for example recently against a Chechen national. Further back in 2016 and 2017, their activities in Montenegro. But despite their brutality and despite their efforts, it is and the determination. In most cases, they do not succeed. For example, as what happened in the Skripal case.
Thank you.
I'm Richard Kennedy. I was the CIA's economic analyst on Poland starting in 1993, and it immediately became apparent that Poland had made extraordinary progress in transitioning away from communism, something for which there was no historical precedent, no theoretical guidebook. Could you say anything about how economic policy was being made in those early days after 1989?
Pan się przedstawił jako był analystą ekonomicznym w CIA od 1993 roku i skomentował, że Polska miała wybitny sukces w przemienieniu się od ekonomii komunistycznej na kapitalistyczną. Był jednym największym sukcesem Europy. Czy może pan skomentować, jaka to jest, o tej polityce ekonomicznej, jakie z tego przyszły lekcje?
Szanowni Państwo, największym powodem naszego sukcesu ekonomicznego jest to, że społeczeństwo, ugrupowania polityczne nie dopuściły do oligarchizacji naszego życia politycznego i gospodarczego. To jest zmora społeczeństw postkomunistycznych, oligarchowie.
One of the reasons is that the Polish system after the fall of communism did not allow a rise of an oligarch class, which was the bane of a number of post-communist countries.
Sprawa oligarchizacji gospodarki i polityki w krajach postkomunistycznych jest zagadnieniem absolutnie kluczowym. Plaga i dominacja oligarchów nad życiem gospodarczym i politycznym powoduje, że niektóre kraje postkomunistyczne, zwłaszcza te, które były bezpośrednio w Związku Sowieckim, mają tak ogromne trudności w utrwalaniu swojej niepodległości i wprowadzeniu jakby demokratycznego ładu w swoim kraju. Oligarchowie są zgubą postkomunistycznych społeczeństw i krajów. Mój kraj na szczęście dał sobie radę, uporał się. U nas też była tendencja na początku lat 90. do wytwarzania się oligarchów w oparciu o jeszcze możliwości układu postkomunistycznego. Na szczęście wygraliśmy i Polska rozwija się dynamicznie. Jesteśmy dumni z naszego rozwoju gospodarczego i politycznego.
The rise of and the influence of the oligarch class is a crucial theme when looking at this period of transition. It became a plague of across the region and causing many problems in countries that were not able to successfully push back against it. Especially had a detrimental effect on the development of democracy in these places. This is not to say that there was no tendency towards it in Poland in the 90s, but thankfully Poland was able to push back and defeat it, and this was, as a result of this, was able to develop dynamically its political and economic system.
Thank you. Any other final question?
Good morning, Minister. My name is Dora Plavitic, and I work with USAID, the Europe and Eurasia Bureau. And I just had a question regarding, I really appreciated your focus on strengthening the Euro-Atlantic integration and how there are threats, especially with maybe some views now taking root in Europe about having a more independent European view from the US or more relationships with the East. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Belt and Road Chinese influence in Europe and how that could also threat the Euro-Atlantic integration, notwithstanding having a really constructive thinking about how the Euro-Atlantic or even the EU should be moving forward. Things change in history, so I think having a constructive view about how things should be moving is good, but not taking away the threats that are there, like you very articulately explained. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit more about what you thought about the Chinese influence as well in all this.
So pani jest bardzo wdzięczna za pana komentarz, że trzeba nadal się rozwijać, ale zawsze mieć w głowie to, że są jeszcze problemy, że są wrogowie, którzy, jak Rosja na przykład, którzy próbują temu się sprzeciwić. Było dobrze tak to podkreślić. Ja też bardzo była wdzięczna za rozmowę o integracji euroatlantycznej i chciałem się więcej dowiedzieć na pana opinię, do jakiego poziomu i jak efektywne jest chińskie wpływ na tę integrację euroatlantyczną.
Szanowni Państwo, wiele elit politycznych europejskich w wielu krajach udaje, że nie widzi zagrożenia ze strony Chin. Polska nie jest takim krajem. Polska, tak jak Stany Zjednoczone, mówi wyraźnie o zagrożeniu chińskim. Byliśmy jednym z pierwszych krajów w ostatnich latach, który doprowadził do aresztowania chińskiego szpiega udającego menadżera znanej firmy Huawei.
Many political elites in Europe pretend that there is, try to pretend that there is no, or don't know about Chinese influence, or there is no Chinese influence. Not so in Poland, where Poland was actually one of the first countries as active in pushing back against it, but it's also one of the, in recognizing the threat, and it's also active in pushing back against it. For example, with recent arrest of a spy within the Polish branch of Huawei.
Chińczycy działają niezwykle cierpliwie i długofalowo. To jak wspomniałem w swoim wystąpieniu o tym, że bardzo często horyzont, jeżeli chodzi o doktrynę bezpieczeństwa w wielu krajach europejskich, kończy się na najbliższej kadencji, z końcem kadencji. To jest ten horyzont. To jest po prostu kompletna nieodpowiedzialność. Wielu polityków europejskich widzi tylko i wyłącznie koniec swojej kadencji i nic więcej. Oni są zupełnie bezradni wobec Chińczyków, którzy działają na wiele lat z długoletnią strategią.
The Chinese are very patient and they plan long term. And the problem with that is that very often the doctrine of political horizons, in other words, many politicians have short horizons based on their electoral windows, and they only look to their next turn in office and getting back into office, and that prevents them from recognizing that long-term patient threat that China poses.
Wspomniałem właśnie o tej strategii chińskiej, tej cierpliwości, nastawieniu na wiele, wiele lat. Dla biedniejszych krajów europejskich Chiny są atrakcyjne, bo oferują inwestycje, a nie dyktują bieżących warunków politycznych. Wydaje im się, że to jest bezpieczny kapitał, konkurencyjny kapitał, bo nie ma bezpośredniego, szybkiego stawiania warunków politycznych.
Because of the long-term planning by China, for many poorer countries, China is an attractive partner because it provides ready investment, quick investment, but not concurrent political demands or political things that it wants to achieve. So in the calculus of the poorer nations, they see that it's relatively easy money without necessarily giving up their, giving in to Chinese political influence in the short term.
Część państw europejskich widzi właśnie tani kapitał, duże inwestycje, zapominając, czym są Chiny. A przecież dalej jest to państwo komunistyczne, tam rządzi partia komunistyczna.
These countries see China as a source of cheap capital and big investments, but forget the fact that China is still a communist country and is still a country that is repressive and not free.
Kiedy byłem w czerwcu w Waszyngtonie i miałem możliwość i wielką przyjemność rozmawiać o sprawach chińskich z Giną Haspel, szefową CIA, powiedziałem jej, że ja będę do końca życia pamiętał, kiedy jako młody student walczący w ramach Solidarności o wolną Polskę w tym samym czasie na placu Tiananmen w Pekinie komunistyczne władze chińskie masakrowały moich rówieśników. Nic się nie zmieniło, to są dalej te same władze, to jest ta sama partia komunistyczna.
I always remember when visiting in June in NDC and meeting with CIA Director Gina Haspel to talk about such issues, and I mentioned how I will always remember as a young student fighting against oppression in Poland, the Tiananmen Square massacre, and this always reminded me that this system is that we have today is the same system. It is not anything different from it.
Kiedy widzimy demonstracje w Hongkongu w imię wolności i demokracji, każdy z nas w tyle głowy ma, że za chwilę zaczną mordować tych demonstrantów.
When we see the demonstrations in Hong Kong, when we view it from our perspective, when I view it from my perspective, I'm expecting that any moment they're going to start murdering these students.
Kiedy słyszę, że Chiny mają i technologie chińskie, i firmy chińskie mają być atrakcyjnym partnerem dla rozwoju technologii 5G na świecie, to ogarnia mnie przerażenie, jak bezmyślni są ludzie, którzy godzą się na takie rzeczy.
when I hear that Chinese trade investments is attractive to particular countries, and they're looking into it with openly, I become very fearful about the lack of understanding of what the implications of Chinese influence is through these methods.
Jeśli technologia 5G ma być jakimś kolejnym skokiem cywilizacyjnym dla ludzkości, to wprowadzanie do tak subtelnych, tak wrażliwych technologii firm chińskich na zasadzie poważnego ich wejścia jest potwornym ryzykiem, jest potworną nieodpowiedzialnością.
For instance, looking at 5G and how it represents this next great leap for humanity, that such subtle and advanced technology, that is not fully recognized, that such subtle and advanced technology presents such great risks for Chinese influence.
Niestety wydaje się, że głos Polski w Europie w tych sprawach jest dosyć osamotniony. Jesteśmy bardzo zaniepokojeni tym, co się dzieje w Europie Zachodniej, w państwach starej Unii, jak bezrefleksyjnie dopuszczają chińskie technologie i chińskie firmy do serca jakby systemu związanego też z bezpieczeństwem ich obywateli. Chińczycy prędzej czy później, jeżeli się to państwo nie zmieni, a nic na to nie wskazuje, żeby się zmieniło, będą stawiali warunki polityczne. Może za 10, może za 15 lat, ale my jako politycy musimy myśleć odpowiedzialnie o tym, co się będzie działo w naszych krajach za 10, 15 i 50 lat, a nie tylko za 2, 3, 4 lata, kiedy kończy się kadencja mojego rządu.
Unfortunately, Poland appears as a lone voice in Europe of warning against the threat posed by Chinese investments in these technologies, and it appears that the others in the EU are just simply don't realize it, and just that. It may not be happening. This political leverage that China exercises may not be happening right now, but it may start happening. That leverage may be applied in 10 to 15 years, and we must think beyond that time. We must think further in the future, not just even 10, 15, next 30, 40, 50 years, to fully recognize this threat. And I personally think of it beyond just our current government, but as a long-term threat to be prepared for over the course of even if political situation changes.
Thank you. Let me just perhaps end on a question wearing my historian's hat. At the heart of today's session are about 100 NIDs declassified by the agency. Could you just comment briefly on the Polish government's current efforts and plans for declassifying historical documentation on these issues?
W świetle tego, że deklasyfikacji kablów ze strony amerykańskiej, tych NIDs, czy może Pan powiedzieć, komentować o jakichkolwiek planach ze strony Polski o deklasyfikacji polskich dokumentów?
Dokumentów dotyczących komunizmu?
Tak.
W Polsce już wiele lat temu powstał Instytut Pamięci Narodowej i wszystkie dokumenty wytworzone przez komunistyczne służby specjalne zostały odtajnione i są publicznie dostępne.
So all the documents that were part of the previous government's, the communist government's intelligence services have been declassified and are available. Was your question more general or just specifically to the communist era?
It was more general. There are 30 years of history since the end of communism.
Może też powiedzieć, może tak bardziej generalnie, dokumenty z ostatnich 30 lat.
Z ostatnich 30 lat nie, to już są dokumenty służb niepodległej Polski. Także te dokumenty są tajne, niejawne i w dyspozycji służb specjalnych.
Yeah, so those of the last 30 years, that's a new services that came into being, and those are secret, and well, there are no plans to declassify them.
Very good. Thank you so much for your speech and your willingness to engage in Q&A. Thank you so much for your speech. I'd like to ask the panelists to join me up on the podium as the minister leaves. I think he has to leave shortly.
Under pressure.
did not know that was going to happen.
Thanks.
You got it.
Sorry? Oh, good.
The odd woman out on this panel.
You made it, Mark. So you got that 6:40 flight?
The 6:40, although it was about
Sorry.
6:50. I was getting nervous.
So where'd you sleep last night?
I went home by go to sleep.
Oh, wow. So you will later today.
Or tomorrow.
Very good. Welcome back. Thank you, Deputy Director Rapp, for your thoughtful opening remarks, and I think we're indebted to Minister Kaminski for a very interesting talk and Q&A. And I now have the privilege to moderate a panel discussion centered around the events 30 years ago, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and also the newly declassified materials that the Deputy Director referenced. Let me upfront say it's wonderful to see so many of you here in the audience, and thank our partners, especially in the Public Affairs Office at the agency, for the efforts in jointly organizing, pulling together this event at, I think, fairly short notice in the scheme of things. So we're very appreciative of this opportunity. Let me also say that we welcome here at the Wilson Center, with an institution that has a firm and long-standing commitment to providing historical context to public policy issues, and especially to providing new archival, declassified documents for the scholarly and the public policy community. Let me say that we welcome the release of the about 100 national intelligence dailies that are part of a larger corpus of documents that have become available in recent years from the U.S. government on the events of 1988, 89, and beyond. As Vice President Rob Litvak mentioned, I invite you to read, to look at these documents. They're accessible in the on the CIA's website, and to read them alongside the many communist world documents that the Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project, part of the History and Public Policy program that I have the privilege to direct here, has collected, translated, and made accessible at no charge through our digital archive at digitalarchive.org. So we're excited about this new release of documents, and some of the I hope some of the panelists will talk about the significance of these materials. Let me also say, of course, and note that the U.S. governmental system for declassifying and processing historical records currently is in crisis. I think this has to be mentioned at this stage, so this is a welcome opportunity here. But I also note that there have in recent years problems have come about in terms of the declassification of materials. The Historical Review Panel, an independent group of academics that has helped the agency towards greater transparency that the chair of that panel announced earlier this year that the CIA had put the group on hiatus without explanation. The suspension was a part of a somewhat disturbing trend in 2017. The agency virtually halted its program of reviewing records more than 25 years old. I appreciate, I know that many of these issues are resource issues, no doubt, and Congress needs to do its part for providing funds for allowing declassification system to function. But I think it's important to note this here. Declassification is vital to a thriving democracy. That was referenced here this morning. Not only does it help to it helps the public to hold leaders accountable. It allows for a more accurate and comprehensive accounting of the past. And in my mind, it is one of the best antidotes against the nascent mythologies of the deep state that you see these days. So I very much hope that today's meeting will inspire renewed efforts to provide access to historical materials on the part of the agency and other parts of the US government. With that said, let me go to our speakers, distinguished panel, and we'll start with the former Deputy Director of the CIA, John McLaughlin. We'll keep introductions very short, but I would like to invite each of the panelists to talk a little bit about their position, their role, introduce themselves to the audience as well as you like.
Thank you, Christian. During this period of time, I was, between 1986 and 1992, I was either the deputy director or the director of two offices in the CIA that covered a lot of this material, and often I was partnered with John Gannon, who is to my left, in those roles. These were the offices of European analysis, which we have some veterans in the office or in the audience from that period, and also the Office of Slavic and Eurasian Analysis. Both of these are now gone and merged into other organizations, but the former covered all of Europe and the latter covered all of the former Soviet Union. I should say I never worked on the Soviet Union when it was the Soviet Union. I worked on the former Soviet Union, beginning about 2 months after its collapse. So that was where I was at that time. And I might begin by saying there are two big points I would make reflecting back on this period, that for those of us who were interested in the durability or lack of durability of communism, Eastern Europe was kind of, to use a phrase, the canary in the mine shaft. In other words, we could see the gradual dissolution of the Cold War, if you will, through events in Eastern Europe. And I think when you read all of the material that's been declassified, and John and I have talked and acknowledged that there's much more material that is out there that isn't declassified, the record looks pretty good in terms of anticipating what happened in Eastern Europe. So that's the first big point. The second point is what happened back then has resonance today in our foreign policy, but also in the intelligence community. Big implications still today, and if we have time, we'll come to that or maybe address it in the questions. Let me cover 4 points very quickly. What was the Soviet Empire like before the collapse? Second, what are some of the key events that surrounded the breach of the wall? Third, what happened in the wake of its demise? And finally, if we have time, what does this all mean today? So I'm not going to go at length about what the Soviet Union was like before the collapse. My main window was Eastern Europe. And let me just say that we could see the strains and cracks developing in the Soviet Union through the prism of Eastern Europe. I'm going to leave aside Yugoslavia, which came apart between 1990 and 1992 and was in many respects a kind of special case, and look at the other states of Eastern Europe, and I would divide them, looking back at it, into three categories. The first was those cases that were pretty clear to us and that we had early indication of. Second category were tougher cases, and there's a third category I would call kind of a special case. So looking at them in serial, first, what were the fairly clear cases? Well, one was the one that Minister Kaminski addressed, Poland itself. And most of my remarks here are anecdotal, based largely on travel and on having visited these places at that time. As you know, solidarity was gaining strength in Poland throughout the 1980s, especially after the end of martial law in the early 80s, 1981 as I recall. There were a number of markers along the way that grabbed our attention. For example, in 1984, the killing of Father Usko. Not remarked on much today, this was a very popular Polish priest in a country where, in our analysis at the time, I recall we were talking about Poland as having two parallel societies. There was the communist world, and then there was the world of the church and home. That was the other society. And much of Polish activity took place in that latter society. And when Papa Usko was killed with some kind of involvement on the part of the regime, this is probably all documented, but at the time that was the common assumption. It brought 250,000 people into the streets for his funeral. And that was a remarkable event in Poland. I happened to be in Poland at one point around the time of a Pope's visit, and when he spoke in Victory Square, it was apparent, this would be the later 1980s, it was apparent that with a wave of his hand or a few sentences, he could have brought the regime down. And he did not, but the fact that you had a Polish Pope was extraordinarily important. The regime yielded to pressure in 1989 in June, and so here we are 5 months before the fall of the wall, and solidarity won decisively. That was an important point, and Poland really was the leader here, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Hungary. Hungary was, as we analyzed it back then, the most liberal, reformist, forward-looking of these countries, the ones that broke most of the rules earlier. A lot of markers occurred. Gorbachev's visit in 1987, when he visited a street that, as I recall, was Ugovaci Street. It was a street in Hungary that was so developed and Western, I always thought of it as kind of Georgetown without the traffic. I mean, all of the major stores were there. It was a luxury street, and Gorbachev was astonished that, well, how could this be happening in a communist country? It was an eye-opening moment, I thought, for Gorbachev. The fall of Kadar, the Hungarian leader, in 1988, and there was my memory of this, and some of my former colleagues may have a different memory, but my memory of it is that the Politburo turned over and that the Politburo then became reformist in majority. And I remember our analyst coming into me, and this is 1988, and saying, Gorbachev didn't do anything. He let this happen. The signal will go out across Eastern Europe that you can get away with changes like this. That was another big marker that I know we documented. And that was 18 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. 6 months before the wall, Gorby gave up the Brezhnev Doctrine, another marker along the way. Czechoslovakia is the third country in this category where things were fairly obvious to us, although it was a very tough regime. I won't go through all of the details there, but as you know, Charter 77, a protest group, had been active since the 1970s. Havel, President Havel, and others seized the initiative from the momentum in Poland and Hungary, and my recall of that anecdotally is that there were just hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, and they wouldn't go home. And I remember talking to our analysts, and our view was, if they don't go home, this regime is collapsing, and they did not go home. And we documented that somewhere. Two tough ones were Romania and Bulgaria. I have to say, I do not think we expected Romania to collapse, but we could not we did not, to my memory, catch the timing of it. Romania was the harshest of these countries. I know when I would go there, I would see this is before the collapse, of course, I would see long lines of people waiting to get scraps of meat like pig's feet and things like that, carrying their plastic bags, which you always carried everywhere in case you saw a line that you could get into. And this was because of Ceausescu's harsh policy of exporting anything that could make money. People were going through entire nights at home without any heat and nothing more than a 15-watt light bulb and sleeping in their winter overcoats. That's the kind of place Romania was at that time. So we didn't see, and when I would go there, we used to joke, I would come back and say, maybe we can read the cracks in the sidewalk. Maybe we could learn something from that. It was really tough. So when that iconic moment captured on video, I'm sure it's online somewhere in YouTube, where all of a sudden Ceausescu is speaking from the balcony and the crowd stops applauding and starts booing around Christmas. That was the crack that was documented so clearly. And at that point, I remember that Christmas was a busy one for us because Romania collapsed in a violent convulsion. Bulgaria was closest to Moscow, very few clues. When I would go there, I went and found something called the Lenin Wall. That was one of the few markers of protest. This was a wall around the university where students would write phrases from Beatles songs, like, "Let me take you down." I think that's Strawberry Fields, if I remember. And then the regime would come and spray paint the wall, and then a couple days later, the students would come back and write it again. So that was one of the few overt signs you could detect of protest in Bulgaria. And so we knew it was fragile, but I can't say that we predicted the moment of collapse or that we said it's over until it really was over. But by and large, and then East Germany's the special case. John may talk about East Germany too, because I know we both were engaged in East Germany pretty deeply. I give us some credit for having unified Germany before Germany unified Germany, in the sense that we combined the parts of our office that worked on East Germany and West Germany into something called the German Working Group. We could see change coming, and we thought we needed to look at Germany holistically. Remember, this again, special case in the sense that East Germany was more exposed to the West than most other countries. They had access, they could get West German television, so they saw all of that. But remember this too, the Stasi was harsh. There were one Stasi officer for every 38 people in East Germany. If you stretched the Stasi files out, you would stretch out for 94 miles. This was a tough place, but there were also markers there. When Gorbachev visited, I think it was 1988 or so, people were in the streets saying, "Save us, Gorby, save us, Gorby." So again, you could see this coming. And I think if you look back at the record, we were quite prescient on East Germany and subsequently on German unification. Time is running short, so I want to skip to a couple of things from trips that I took around this time. I went with Judge Webster, who was then the CIA director, to Germany, West Germany, about a month before the wall came down. And we visited the headquarters of German intelligence, the BND, which was then headed by a very brilliant analyst strategic analyst, Hans-Jörg Wieck. And to a person, when we asked about all of these crowds in the streets, everywhere, to a person, the German intelligence service, all these senior officers and policy people we met with said, "Not in my lifetime will Germany be reunited." They could not conceive of it, and yet our analysts could. Our analysts were talking quite freely about, as they put it, the German question being back on the table. And so it's useful sometimes to look at things from a distance. Okay. Well, it was in France and the UK during that same period, and the attitude toward German unification was more of, they weren't looking forward to it. In fact, a joke I heard in France was, what do you get when you put two Germanys together? And the answer was, out of the way. That was kind of their nervous anticipation about all of that. I'll just mention one other, because I want to stop at our time here. Mention one other anecdote from a trip. On that same swing through, later went to East Europe with Judge Webster, after the wall had come down. And just mention in a sentence or two 3 things. First, in Poland, we were already quite close to Poland. You know, CIA sought to establish relationships on an intelligence basis with all of these countries very quickly. Sometimes I think almost ahead of the State Department. I mean, we had officers who would go around and knock on doors. Hey, I'm from the CIA. We'd like a relationship with you. And sometimes, most of the time, they said, yeah, we're going to have an intelligence service. Well, Poland was way ahead. In fact, on that trip, Judge Webster gave an award to the Polish intelligence service because they had helped us. I can give you the details. This is all unclassified now. They had helped us get CIA officers out of Kuwait who had been caught there when Saddam invaded Kuwait, and we were stuck there. And the Polish intelligence service, through an elaborate operation that's now been talked about in the press, got us out of there. Hungary, when we met with the Hungarians, they very candidly said to us, we used to steal your secrets. We were really good at it. We used to steal your technology in particular. We were good at that, but we're not going to do that anymore. We want to be your partners. And to his credit, I believe, Judge Webster, a hero to, I think, John and myself, very quickly said, we're in. And he embraced that idea and formed a relationship. Czechoslovakia was another question. We were dealing with poets and scene designers and motorcades, where the busiest person in the motorcade was the guy with the jumper cables, because they were still driving around old East European cars and things. And I'd mention one other trip, which was with, just because it's a funny anecdote, with Director Gates did the first trip of a director to Russia, independent Russia, after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And at that point, at a reception, a Russian intelligence analyst came up to me and said, I've heard this expression, tell it like it is. What does that mean? Can you explain? Which, of course, I could, but it was obviously an alien concept to them. So there's a lot more we could talk about on, maybe come back to it, on what all of this means today, because it does have meaning today. But I'm going to stop there for now. That's a very kind of personal, anecdotal look back at this period.
Thank you so much. That's fascinating insights that give some richer texture to some of the documents, the story, the narrative as we know it. Next up, we have the former director of the Office of European Analysis, John Gannon. We're privileged to have you here. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. As you said, I was deputy director under John during much of I think all of the period of 1989. I became the director for European Analysis from 1992 to 1995, then the DDI for another 2 years, and then 4 years as chairman of the National Intelligence Council before retiring and going off and working on the Hill for a period, and then also doing a 9/11 review commission for the FBI. So I have maintained relations with the intelligence community even after retirement. It's great. I'm grateful to the Wilson Center for actually forcing me to focus on the experience, really the rich experience we had in dealing with all the events of 1989. I'm grateful to my friends and colleagues at CIA, I think, for releasing these documents, I think, which show that with all the complexity of the issues going across all of these countries, if you read these NIDs, as we call them, we were very close to the ground on what was going on in these individual countries, and we were providing to the national security community overall an early morning look, an update for leaders of that community that very often had only that as an experience and substance for the rest of the day. So I think the NIC played a very important role, but I'll have more to say about that. On November 9th, I guess, November 8th, I emailed John and we exchanged emails about our recollection of when the wall went down. And I remember going to his office on the 6th floor and sitting with him as we watched the NBC News and saw the people coming up over the wall. I vividly remember my own reaction at the time, and I think John's was close to it, that for the first time, really, we saw that the single strategic threat from the Soviet Union that really had dominated our work in the intelligence community for 45 years actually had a chance of collapsing. So there was that. But the other thing, as we saw the tremendous union of people from East and West, the great emotional experiences we were witnessing, frankly, I don't know if I ever admitted it to John, but I choked up myself because I was aware that we were seeing, symbolically anyway, it took a little longer for it all to be complete, but 140 million people who had lived under the repressive Soviet systems were now tasting freedom and knowing that they were going to keep tasting freedom. It reminded me too from my many trips to Eastern Europe before the wall collapsed that the people of the region deserve so much of the credit for what happened. It wasn't just the leaders of the East and the West coming to a new agreement on how we would deal with this region. The struggles and the courage of the people of that region were determinative. Other factors were involved also, but they were enjoying a freedom that they had fought for and they deserved to have. So there were 3 points that I will make, or three trends or forces that were interacting during all the period of 1989. First of all was Gorbachev, because I'm going to make the point that all the 6 countries of the Warsaw Pact that we all ended up talking about, they're very different. And so the idea that I don't remember ever talking about dominoes at the beginning of this crisis because we recognized the differentiation that was necessary when you looked at these countries. But the single thread that ran through it all was Gorbachev's abandoning or moving away from bedrock Soviet policies in the region. So that was always there. So we now have the benefit of a lot more information than we had at the time. And I do want to emphasize that one of the challenges that I had in looking at this region was, because I teach at Georgetown, and in 1989 is always an issue that I love to cover, we didn't know then so much of what we know now. And Mark has a terrific paper that demonstrates how we have been enriched by the opening of archives and the memoirs that have been written by folks. So I really wanted to force myself to look back at what did we really know at the time. The other issue is what Richard Hoyer, who's a great tradecraft analyst for intelligence, and he talks about hindsight bias, and that tells you that analysts often look back and they remember more than evidence will support how prescient they were in the predictions that they made. That overseers of intelligence, particularly in the Congress, will tend to exaggerate how easy it was to make predictions at the time that they were actually made. And then policymakers, some are known for writing memoirs where they talk about how cool they were in the face of these changes, how prescient they were, and how decisive they were. And when I look back on all the National Security Council meetings that I attended, they were all in over their heads for the most part. I think, so to some extent, we all were, and there was that struggle to catch our stride in dealing with very fast-moving events. So when Gorbachev, I want to say, he was, and I think he always was, a communist, and he was determined to reform, but I don't think he never abandoned the determination to reform the communist systems. And even as we saw the collapse of the regimes in Eastern Europe, I mean, he believed that the people, when they were freed, they would still want to maintain their relationships with Moscow. That was a naive belief. It was the same kind of belief, by the way, that Pope John Paul had, because he believed in the very courageous role he played in Poland, that he believed that when you lifted the communist yoke from the Polish people, they would increase their commitment to Catholicism. He didn't live to see how disappointed he might have been had he lived. So Gorbachev, he was remarkably consistent. I think we see it now more clearly than we did at the time, and in driving reform and rejecting the requests and demands of the East European governments for financial bailouts, and because all of them were heavily in debt, with the exception of Romania, that took pride in wiping out its debt by starving its people, and then also making it clear increasingly that military intervention from the Soviet side would not be an option as the Eastern European governments dealt with the crisis that unfolded. Gorbachev saw gaps. I mean, he had an experience in the West. He saw first of all the economic gaps that he thought were widening between the Soviet Union and the West, and he didn't see they were going to would decrease. He also saw huge, growing, alarming technology gaps, which the Reagan administration helped him to remind him of with the SDI program. The sense that the Soviet Union could nothing do under their existing structures to catch up. So so what he saw increasingly in Eastern Europe, and again, I think if you go back in time, remembering he maintained his commitment to communism, but I think Chernobyl was the first real wake-up call for him. I think when he wanted perestroika and glasnost to be his signature, that the signature on his change in Soviet policies, and what he got was a bunch of lying military folks and other leaders who he couldn't get the true story. And I would have to add that he didn't tell the true story either, along with Edward Shevardnadze at the time of Chernobyl, which was a major disaster. But he ended up then reading the Riot Act to a lot of the military officers and removing them. His experience with the East European regimes had a similar effect. So my point I'm making is that he changed his views as he dealt with the realities in the region, and he didn't actually know, for example, how much in debt the East German regime was. Even in October, before Honecker was removed, he still didn't have the totally reliable data on how badly off that economy was. But he was so concerned as he dealt with the leaders of these that he quickly differentiated. I think he had respect for the Poles at all times, and certainly with Jaruzelski there, he had confidence that system could be managed. He, in fact, encouraged each step of the way towards the elections in June, and ultimately dealing with the Chairman Murkowski on that famous telephone call, where basically, what should we do, Mr. Chairman Gorbachev? You should go into opposition. So we certainly noticed that back at Langley, having the Soviet chairman encouraging the Poles to support an opposition government or a democratic government in the Warsaw Pact. That was new and different. He at the same time, he came to detest Husak and Yakis in Czechoslovakia. He had total disdain for Ceausescu. He thought that Zhivkov was a fool who got involved in a persecution of the Turkish minority in the country to deflect from the terrible situation the economy was in. And Zhivkov, who had been in power since the 50s, actually fashioned himself as a leader of information technology in the region. It was kind of a cardboard set of policies that he had. So Gorbachev saw through all that. And in Romania, he thought, and he described Ceausescu as a jackass. So he was actively, in time, encouraging leaders beneath him to replace these aging, corrupt dictators. So he was able to make that differentiation. We probably didn't see it as much then as we do now. He also was with allies like Yakovlev and Shevardnadze, who all agreed on the need for reform. And by the way, they saw in many ways that the Eastern populations enjoyed a higher standard of living in the Soviet Union that was actually bailing them out. And he saw he needed to put an end to that. He also, I think much earlier on, than we recognized, was sending messages, certainly with the way he withdrew from Afghanistan, I think back in February of 1989, and then on the arms control policies that he supported, and then the communication that he engaged in with the Bush administration and with Helmut Kohl in Germany, as each of the crises unfolded in each of the countries, clearly demonstrated that he thought his relationship with the West was critical to the kind of reforms that he wanted to see. So we were perhaps slower to recognize that and to incorporate that into the kind of analysis we did. I do want to say, just emphasize again, the second trend, of course, is what was happening among the countries. John has talked about the individual differences that we saw there. Certainly Poland led the way, but Poland had over 10 years of opposition. It had a tension with both the Soviet Union and with Jaruzelski and his leadership that had come to be manageable by 1989. In fact, the Jaruzelski had run out of options, and what we saw there was ultimately almost a condominium in the end that in this smooth transition that Poland afforded itself and the rest of the world. But the point I want to make too is that while the Jaruzelski and the Solidarity, they managed the relationship with the Soviet Union, they never stopped fearing it. And that's a consistent thread that you see all the way through the other countries, that even though Gorbachev was showing the commitment to reform and his refusal to use violent means to repress the people of Eastern Europe, there was a concern always, up until Czechoslovakia, and I'll finish with that point, that things could happen in the individual East European countries that could drive Gorbachev in a different direction, or could drive the conservatives within the Soviet Union, his opposition within the Soviet Union, against him. There could be a coup. And then we had debates within our analytic community about the chances that a coup would topple Gorbachev at some point. So again, as we went through the individual countries, this was not an undifferentiated mass. There were 6 different stories, and by saying that, I'm emphasizing the point that anything could have gone wrong or differently. Missteps could have delayed or even derailed some of the good news ultimately that came out of the region, and that's the way we saw it. We weren't just waiting for the next domino. We were really focused on the individual challenges that are represented by what was happening in these countries. The third force that we dealt with, of course, and I think so did the region, was the Bush 41 and his team, and that's like Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft, Bob Gates, and so forth. This was a more cautious and conservative approach to the region than what we had experienced with Ronald Reagan and Poland in particular. It wasn't a risk aversion, but there was a fear because we couldn't predict what was going to happen. We saw all the uncertainty that was associated with the developments in these countries, and there was a legitimate fear, I believe, on the part of the Bush administration of instability. And if President Bush made clear, I think, to his own team and to the government and to the people in the region that he did not want to rock any boats, and there would be no gloating, a term that he used more than once. As events unfolded, it would seem to be in U.S. interest. We would not gloat in any way that could destabilize the trends that were occurring in the region. And over time, it also became, I think, a commitment on his part to Gorbachev, where he had developed, as Reagan had, a closer relationship and a trust with Gorbachev that he knew the risk Gorbachev was taking, and he wasn't going to make it more difficult. So that was there, and I'll talk finally about the intelligence community and how we reacted. There's a rhythm that comes out of the way the intelligence community supports an administration. And so the Bush administration was very clear about what it wanted from intelligence. We had a president who loved the CIA. We had Brent Scowcroft along with him. They understood the limitations of intelligence, but they also where it could be useful. Where, for example, where signals intelligence or imagery could actually help in particular circumstances, and where liaison relationships could be very helpful as they were, particularly in Poland and in Hungary. Speaking then of the intelligence community itself, I have not said that I thought that conservative approach by the Bush administration was a bad thing. The fact is, in my recollection, the relationship that we had as analysts and collectors in the intelligence community with the Bush administration was the absolute high water mark for intelligence policy relations in my career. We did all the NIDs that you've seen, and I said they were a very good document of record of what we're saying about individual countries and trends as we move across the region. But we were daily supporting the national security process. All the National Security Council meetings, we were helping to staff them. We were in constant close relationship with State Department, with diplomats, with the whole national intelligence community, again, on a daily basis. We weren't making strategic predictions about how this movie was going to end. We were tracking day-to-day events in what I think was one of the finest examples of sustained situational awareness. Constant engagement with the policy community, constant communication in a way that George H.W. Bush would tell you if he could today, but did tell us how useful and helpful it was to have us working with him. So my point is the NIDs that you're reading are a very good document of record, but there's a much larger record of the engagement that we had with the Bush team that tells a much fuller story about what we did. When I look back on it now, and this is just a final point on impact, I think that what happened in the course of the Bush administration was there was a development of trust with the intelligence community, trust with Gorbachev, and ultimately a trust that endured as we went into the more problematic Yeltsin period in the Soviet Union, because we had developed a lot of relationships and understood institutions better simply because we had been much closer to them. So what some people call holding back of the Bush administration actually allowed the development of a relationship that was sustainable in very productive ways as we went into the 90s. the impact on the intelligence community. John talked about coming out of the opening of the wall. I mean, there was no question that we were talking about German unification. By the way, it's interesting that we initially talked about it as reunification. In some places, there was a major policy decision made that we would call it unification. So you will see in the NIDs how that word changes. But we were committed to greater integration, and that's where John. And I was working for John, and then Bert and Gerber on the Director of Operations side. We all came together and formed a German working group, and I think it was exciting for us to see how we were able to, we've created a platform so the policymakers dealing with all the uncertainties they had to deal with on these issues could go to one area where we could bring together the assets of the intelligence community to benefit them. And then when I became director for Europe in 1992, I had Bob Blackwell with me as my deputy, and we worked with Admiral Studeman, the deputy director, and formed the Balkan Task Force, which was the same principle. In fact, we enlarged it to a more community participation. So that policymakers, and by the way, the Balkans became very confusing for policymakers. You had to pronounce Shepa, Srebrenica, you had to pronounce the names, you had to understand the complex history of these regions and why it all mattered. And to be able to go to one group, one intelligence platform that could integrate it all for you was a tremendous help. And I think that set a trend within the intelligence community, recognizing how the importance of integration would be. So I will stop there, and I will be silent so that others might speak.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Mr. Gannon. That you actually anticipated several of my questions. So just terrific. Great. We now turn to Mark Kramer. There's no one who's seen more documents in the Russian and Eastern European archives, possibly with the exception of Svetlana Savranskaya, who just joined us. But Mark is a leading scholar. So Mark, if you can talk a little bit about also the documents, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, good. I'm going to be focusing on a couple of aspects of what the seminar is about today. But let me precede it by saying that the problem the intelligence community had, not just CIA, but the intelligence community as a whole, but particularly the CIA had in the late 1980s, was just the sheer pace of change, where things that seemed inconceivable 1 month might the next month already seem to have been inevitable because they had occurred. And Joe Nye, I remember a colleague of mine at Harvard who later became the head of the National Intelligence Council in the 1990s, I think it was. But he, in the late 80s, I remember he said that that the problem was that Gorbachev kept on, this will make sense only to people who know a little bit about American football, so I apologize if there are some in the audience who aren't familiar with it. But where what was happening was that the U.S. administration at this point, I think it was still Reagan, but it might have already been Bush, that they keep moving the goalposts back, and Gorbachev keeps on going back and crossing them. And so the faster that they move them, he keeps pace as well, moving backward. And that's what was happening at this point, was that it was particularly in the changing nature of Soviet goals in Central and Eastern Europe that had so profoundly changed. And given that change, it wasn't all that surprising once people in the region recognized that they no longer faced the threat of a Soviet invasion, which they didn't until well into 1989. They still had to be concerned about that. But once they did, it isn't surprising that they took advantage of it while they could. So the problem then for U.S. policymakers was especially to understand where Soviet intentions were throughout this, but then also to understand the the events within individual countries. Let me say, I've taken part in quite a few conferences this year, mostly in Europe, that have dealt with, this is a conference dealing with the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and well, it should be, because everywhere in Eastern Europe, communism collapsed, including Albania and Yugoslavia, in somewhat different ways. But there were another legacy of 1989, though, is in some ways just as enduring, but a very different legacy, which is the same day that the elections took place in Poland, 4th of June, 1989. The Chinese army was sent into the streets of Beijing and ruthlessly murdered hundreds of unarmed protesters and crushed what had been a quite large and boisterous pro-democracy movement in China, and has made China an authoritarian dictator, and it has remained a dictatorship as a result of that event. That single display of murderous will was sufficient to crush that pro-democracy movement. I mean, it's not the only thing. Clearly, the years of economic growth since then have played a role. But that legacy is there in thinking about 1989. And it, of course, is one that CIA was looking at. The task for today, the people declassifying documents for today's seminar, is that there'd already been a huge amount of CIA documentation on these events available. Some of these are at the Bush Library, others on CIA's website. But one of some of these, particularly pertaining to China, are still illuminating today. For example, when I looked at some of the ones that I got from the Bush Library, they brought out that in 1989, in addition to the protests that gained a great deal of attention, especially in Beijing and other large cities, there were large demonstrations in Tibet, which marked the 30th anniversary of the final crushing of the final subjugation of Tibet in 1959. In those protests, when I saw those in the National Intelligence Daily, one of the CIA documents, this was, again, one from the Bush Library, it showed that they were actually keeping track of these despite the lack of good information about them. So the documents that were released for today's seminar should be read in conjunction with this larger body of CIA material that's available, because you will find, for example, that there were, for example, the impact of the unilateral reductions that Gorbachev announced at the December 1988. That CIA did some very good analyses of what those meant, and those two were released earlier. Let me say, though, that one of the things as I looked at the larger body of the CIA material is wondering what exactly policymakers were consuming, because it was the pre-internet age, but there still was a great deal available. For example, RFE-RL, the research arm of RFE-RL, was doing excellent work during this time. And in some cases, I think if I were looking for good, solid insight, that I might be inclined to turn there. Or the New York Times in 1989, just again, given the dramatic and rapid nature of things, established a whole special section of the front page. It was a supplement to the front page with just dedicated reporting to what was going on. This was particularly the case in October and November, but it had existed to some extent even before that. So were policymakers looking at that? Were they looking at just at CIA materials, or was it some mix of these? And you can sometimes discern this in looking at the the Bush Library out in College Station. But often it is difficult to tell where policymakers were drawing their information about what was going on. And that's where I think I would like to know more about whether, for example, CIA was contacted by some policymaker asking about a report in the New York Times and what light CIA might have on it. For example, in one the NIDs that are here and others that were released on Czechoslovakia. In Czechoslovakia on the 17th of November, the Velvet Revolution began. And that is mentioned here, and it's discussed in some other CIA materials. What isn't discussed, though, is something that I learned only this year when I was in Slovakia, which is on the 16th of November, that is the day before, there had actually been a large student demonstration in Bratislava in Slovakia. And apparently it got no attention in most, I couldn't really find any mention of it in Western newspapers, even though there were thousands of students that took part in it. And apparently, again, it's because it wasn't in the capital. It was in the capital of Slovakia, but not in the capital of Czechoslovakia. And so there were events like that, too, where I wondered, are some of the resources of the intelligence community focused more on the national capitals or the large cities, and do they track? They clearly did track Tibet very well. But sometimes in Central and Eastern Europe, it does seem that there was a focus particularly on the capital cities. The question of East Germany came up, and for example, this may be it just hasn't been declassified yet. Because as you look at the NIDs, you'll see that there are huge redactions in them. And that's not just these recent ones. That's all of the ones that I've seen, which are several hundred by now, or maybe from this period about 300 or 400. And I gave copies to Christian too, so the ones that I've seen, so they'll be made available for anyone. On the 9th of October 1989, there was a large demonstration in Leipzig. Prior to that, both Erich Mielke, the head of the State Security, and Erich Honecker, who was then head of the Communist Party, had talked almost enthusiastically about the prospect of a Chinese solution. And they mobilized, they made preparations for a large-scale crackdown in Leipzig. Spear blood was stockpiled, ambulances were mobilized, doctors were readied, hospital beds were requisitioned for wounded protesters, yet there was no such crackdown. And I looked to see whether CIA had explained that, what had happened, why Mielke, for example, backed away from that, or why was it simply that they didn't get the guarantee from Soviet Union or some other. And similarly, one last thing, and then I will conclude, is John mentioned Bulgaria. My wife was then a university student in Bulgaria. She's originally from there, and she was 21 in 1989 and was one of the university students who were forming what were called civic groups. And the Državna Sigurnost, the Bulgarian state security, was actually keeping very close track of these groups because they suspected that they were seeking to overthrow the communist regime, which is probably more grandiose than they actually were. But the state security clearly also didn't understand a great deal about these groups. Many of they were formed around intellectuals, but they extended well beyond that, whereas the state security tended to think that if they just clamped down on the universities, that would put an end to unrest in Bulgaria, which was much less intense than in other countries, but still it was enough to result in Todor Zhivkov's downfall on the 10th of November, the day after the wall opened. So the final thing then that I will say is, in thinking about how the intelligence community coped with this enormously fast and dramatic series of events that contributed to what we now call the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, is when you're living through it, you're not sure what the outcome is going to be. And that's why that even as you begin to make bold predictions about where things could go, you also want to worry that you might be engaging in wishful thinking. Unfortunately, that didn't turn out to be the case in 1989. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. Terrific. Our final speaker is Dr. Constanze Stelzenmüller, who will be speaking as a very young eyewitness to the event 30 years ago, as a former journalist and scholar of these events. She is a fellow at Brookings, the European Center at Brookings Institution, and currently the Kissinger Chair at the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. And, I may say, an alumna of the Wilson Center, so
Yes,
welcome back.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I'm very touched to be invited to this panel, and I can tell you that 30 years ago, nothing would have prepared me for the assumption that I could ever be sitting here discussing this with you. It's been a pleasure, fascinating, and honor to hear you all. And the thing is, of course, that I was, as some of you may know who have read this, know that I was very much not an eyewitness. To explain, I'm a West German Foreign Service brat. And in fact, I was at graduate school at the Kennedy School at Harvard on the day the wall came down. I had, however, spent a month in East Berlin as a 14-year-old coming from Washington, and this is how this happened. My family had a habit of switching kids with the family we were best friends with when one of us moved. And when we were about to move from Washington to Madrid in 1976, just after Franco's death, my mother said, "Where are Breutinghams now?" "Ah, he's DCM in East Berlin. Darling, this will be so educational for you." And so my mother went off in the middle of the Cold War to the East German embassy in Washington to ask for a children's visa for her 14-year-old to spend a month in East Berlin in the summer. 2 hours later, she came back, threw her handbag on my bed, plumped down in my Sears Roebuck rocking chair, and lit a cigarette, laughing so hard she could hardly smoke, and said, "You should have been there. It was wonderful. They thought I was trying to defect." And they were very disappointed and upset with me when I made it clear that I didn't want to defect, but that I did actually want a children's visa for you. And so they nagged at me for a while, and then finally they threw this visa at me and threw me out. So this is how I ended up spending a month in East Berlin in 1976. When the Breutinghams, and of course Hans Otto Breutingham, the Germany experts among you will know the name, became a key person in the unification debate because he was the top innerdeutsche Beziehung, inter-German affairs negotiator in the Chancery before '89 and ended up becoming Justice Minister in Brandenburg. And so, and at the time, he and his wife as well, of course, had already been spending a great deal of time talking to East German dissidents, to artists, to writers, to musicians, and were keenly aware, even in 1976, of these strains of dissent, dissatisfaction, unhappiness, and all that. Now, I have to say, I, as a 14-year-old, was basically incapable of taking any of this in. I spent much of the day bicycling around on the bike of their eldest daughters around East Berlin and going to museums because she was still in school in West Berlin. She would cross the border every day to go to school in West Berlin. And I would ask naive questions at the dinner table in the evening, whereupon my host parents would look at the wainscoting meaningfully and say, "Darling, we'll explain that later to you in the garden." Um, and after a month, I flew back to my family's new home in Madrid, and my mother said, "Well, how was it? How was it?" And I said, "Well, you know what? It was kind of like living in an old newsreel, except that I was in color." And that was, of course, because I was wearing American clothing, and people were staring at me, mystified. You know, what was this sort of teenager doing, bicycling around East Berlin? Anyway, I will have to confess to you, I think the learning impact of that for me was practically zero. In retrospect, I have to laugh at myself, and I deeply regret not having asked more intelligent questions, but there you are. And so I ended up being at graduate school at Harvard, writing my doctoral thesis about direct democracy in America. On the day that the wall fell, a friend of mine called me up and said, "You have to turn on the TV, the wall's down." I didn't believe her. She said, "Just turn it on." I went and turned on this huge old chess TV that we had in our Somerville double-decker, and saw all these people dancing with sledgehammers and champagne bottles in their hands, and to my immense surprise, because I thought I was, interested in this politically, but emotionally basically indifferent, because we had no family and we'd never been posted on the other side of the Iron Curtain. To my immense surprise, I burst into tears. I couldn't stop sobbing, because I did realize in that moment that my entire life had changed. And it had changed not just for me as a citizen of West Germany and Europe, and of course I didn't predict anything, much less reunification, but I think I realized that I was going to be going back. And before that, I had seen my stay in Harvard very much as the escape route out of Cold War Europe. And a number of my age cohort stayed and reinvented themselves as Americans. I didn't, I went back. So anyway, the thing I referenced here is an essay that Brookings made me write at short notice over the end of the summer, which horrified me, because I, of course, unlike you, was not just not an eyewitness, but I'm not a historian. And so the only way that I thought I could usefully write this essay was to do it, was to use my ignorance as a starting point. And what I did realize, though, is that there is now a great deal of, as it were, third generation or third decade literature in German about what happened in 1989 and the consequences, both in terms of personal memoirs, in terms of sociological, economic, and political analysis, which is extraordinarily rich, and so far I think has not been translated into English. And I've tried to skim the what I think are the key texts of that in my essay. For those of you that read German, this is really rich reading. And the point that I want to make here is that I think as I look for the first time as somewhat somebody perhaps at the cusp of my own career, at the events of 30 years ago, I find it striking how different the circumstances of then and now seem to be. And this is coming out in conversation after conversation. Yesterday, the German ambassador hosted a lunch with Horst Teltschik and Bob Zellick, where they talked about the conversations that they had with each other at the time, how they shared talking points, how they shared talking points with other European partners, and what the degree of trust and careful coordination and thinking through the options, I think is, at least it seems to me in retrospect, what enabled those of you who were, as you so graciously said, were in over your heads. I think that is what enabled you to distinguish the relevant from the irrelevant, and to see the great lines of narrative developing, and then to jump on opportunities. I used to say about my own career as a journalist, I was a journalist for a decade and a half, and somewhat prided myself on almost never using anything secret. But I used to say that meticulous preparation is what enables you to recognize a story when you hit it, and to then, run after it and hunt it down. And I think that what I'm seeing now is an almost wholesale breakdown of trust and structures and relationships of collaboration and cooperation, distressingly, not just within the transatlantic alliance, but also within countries. And as someone who, as it were, felt that she had to grow into the gift that was 1989, what I've described in my essay as a moment of amazing grace, and I mean that in the theological sense. I'm a Lutheran. In the sense that, there are moments in history when something good happens to you that you have done absolutely nothing for, and then you strive to grow into it and to earn it and to own it. And it seems to me that right now we are at a point where we are at great risk of losing it. Not just losing it, but I think destroying the achievements of the last 30 years through mutual distrust, the inability to cooperate and collaborate, and through allowing it seems to me, the delegitimization and the gradual destruction of those values that I think helped us to win in 1989. The respect for rules-based international order, representative democracy, and open society, and yes, evidence-based analysis and science. And that all of that is now being questioned by enemies outside, by authoritarians and illiberals, but also by enemies inside, and those are, sadly, some of them are in government in parts of the European Union. I think that it is accurate, only accurate, to call Viktor Orban an enemy of the operating system of representative democracy and the liberal order that I have just described. All you have to do is read his famous summer speeches to understand his vision for Europe and for the world. And then, of course, there are the internal enemies, the enemies, and I have to say, I use this word enemies. I've surprised myself in using it because I remember going to law school in Bonn, the old capital of West Germany, in the first half of the 80s, thinking, Jesus, this is so polarized, I can hardly breathe. There's the people who want chunks of Poland back on the right, and then there's the Falken, the hard right section of the German left on the left, and I was in a sort of liberal death strip in the middle because I had an Anglo-American childhood and felt that both of this was ridiculously extreme and had no sense of how badly people were off who lived in other parts of the world. Yeah, including in Spain, where I had finished school. But I think that one of the distinguishing characteristics of this new moment is that we actually are seeing enemies of what they call the system, and it happens to be the system of representative democracy, and open, diverse, inclusive societies. And I find that is the last thing I would have expected in 1989. But I think one of the sad lessons of 1989, of course, is that some of us became complacent, and I think none more so than the Germans, because as better writers than I have explained, and I'm thinking of the famous essay by Thomas Bagge in the Wilson Quarterly a year ago, decided that while we had been definitely behind the curve in the 20th century, now the curve was coming after us. And that, in fact, everybody, not just, it wasn't the Poles or the Czechs or Gorbachev or the Americans who had really won the Cold War. It was us, because we had been a model of atonement and the laying bare of historical memory, and therefore, we just all we needed to do was tell other people to follow our lead, and then we would be good. And I think what we're seeing now, particularly in the politics of Eastern Germany, and in the recent electoral successes of the AfD, that was a huge mistake. My last point is this. I don't want to engage, however, in the opposite of wishful thinking, which is, as it were, a negative determinism. I do not think that we are on an inevitable downward trajectory to hell. And I think that, in fact, we would be creating a self-fulfilling prophecy if we indulge ourselves in that kind of thinking. We're perfectly capable of screwing up on our own in this regard without the Russians, the Chinese, the Turks, the Iranians, or the AfD. So I think what we need to do is get a grip, rebuild, and in particular, rebuild trust in ourselves, in our institutions, and in those who are our real friends. And I think those of us in this room know what I mean by that. Thank you.
Thank you, Constanze. Thank you for terrific, rich presentations. I'm going to skip my questions because we're quickly running out of time and go straight to questions and comments from all of you. I do want to bring this meeting to an end at 12:30. So if you could please be succinct and in your questions. We'll start over there. Yep.
Thank you very much. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, and I spent 6 years in the former Soviet Union and when it was the Soviet Union, including Moscow, Chechnya, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan. And one of the things that impressed me about what happened with the collapse is how relatively peaceful it was. There were exceptions. There were problems in Tajikistan. There was the Chechen War and so on. Apart from Gorbachev's influence, how do you account for this?
Well, let me just say the most striking area where it was peaceful was definitely Central and Eastern Europe. With the exception of Romania, which is a big exception, everything that occurred in that region was a striking contrast to what had happened on the 4th of June in Beijing, and that's why some of the conferences that I went to this year, they would use phrases like annus mirabilis and that sort of thing. And I think it's right, to capture that, because certainly I was a graduate student, in the mid-'80s, and if someone had asked me, do you think that communism within a few years will come to a peaceful end in Eastern Europe, I would have just laughed. It seemed inconceivable even as it was happening in some way. But in the Soviet Union, it was a somewhat different. I mean, certainly the major changes that led to the end of the Soviet Union were peaceful, but there was considerable violence in the wake of, or as the Soviet Union was collapsing in Georgia. The Russian government sponsored insurgencies in South Ossetia and Abkhazia in 1992 and 93. Even earlier in Armenia and Azerbaijan, there were wars that killed many thousands of people, tens of thousands in total. Moldova, there was a separatist war in Transnistria that the Russian 14th Army backed, and then you mentioned Tajikistan, the civil war that happened there. So there it was a more mixed picture. There was considerable violence, even as the country was disintegrating.
Thank you. Up front here, and then Dieter Detke, and then Charles.
I'm Bill Rapp. Since I retired, I've been the Center for the Study of Intelligence referent in the Europe and Eurasia Mission Center, which is the organization, or the successor organization to the offices that you both, John, so ably led. And I worked for both Johns on numerous occasions in stages of our careers. I wanted to say I'm very happy that you pointed out that beyond the NID, there was so much else that we did as agency officers in support of the policymakers during this period that the NIDs can't quite get at, and one of them being all the briefings downtown that were made. And John, you probably expect this question coming, but I'm wondering if there's anything more you wanted to say about those briefings, because we can't really capture those in the documents. But there was one briefing in particular I wondered if you could illuminate us on, and that was the one in the Oval Office, I think 2 days before the fall of the wall, when you took a team of analysts down there with you.
Great question.
Yeah. Well, John Gannon and I talked a little bit about this before we sat down, and we were reminiscing about briefings that we did for, I'll get to the Oval Office, but briefings that we did systematically for the key person on the National Security Council staff at that time, who was the director for this area, Robert Blackwell. And I remember this was an example of building relationships with the policy community, because the first time I called him on a secure phone, I said, I'm from the Office of European Analysis, and we'd like to help you. And he said, I don't have time, bang, and hung up. And it took about 3 more calls before he said, yeah, tell me more. And we were reminiscing because at the point when we started taking analysts down to brief him on a systematic basis, he considered that his secret weapon. And John was reminding me that he told us, don't tell other people about this because they'll know what I know. He found our analysts to be have a couple qualities that were unique in the government. First, they would tell you what they thought, unexpurgated. And second, they were discreet. They wouldn't go out and leak it. So it was this unique little bubble he created with analysts that John led and that I would take down there, in which we had these very candid discussions. And then we would also trail him around the world as he was working on these issues, particularly on German unification, with a cable that we put together today. Sounds like, the Dark Ages, but we would actually put together a physical cable that went to him with sort of daily updates on everything that was happening. But that was the front end of a very finely developed process we had, including with people like Bob Zellick. In fact, I wrote down here something that I often say to students when I teach graduate students too. And when we talk about intelligence successes and failures, your failures are very obvious and you can't avoid them. Your successes are harder to see because sometimes nothing happens because of your success. An embassy doesn't get blown up. You've succeeded, but no one knows that. But sometimes it's just that intelligence is woven into the fabric of a successful policy. It's just part of the whole enterprise that makes something move forward. And I think that's part of what John was talking about a few minutes ago. So the Oval Office briefing was about 2 days, as I recall, before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it was the first time I had been in the Oval Office as an analyst, so I was pretty worried about it. And I was reminiscing in a note with John that if an hour before, my briefing was destroyed because everything was changing so rapidly. In fact, I said to President Bush, 41, when I arrived, that I've torn up my notes 3 times in the car coming down here. He was such a gracious man. He just said, well, tell me what you think. And as he poured us a cup of coffee, believe it or not, the President of the United States. But in my office, prior to going down, I'd sat down with one of our very brilliant division chiefs at that point. I believe he was a division chief, a fellow named Gene Wickland, who is now deceased, regrettably. But I said to Gene, I don't know what I'm going to say. I mean, my briefing here is just gone. And he said, well, use this technique. Tell him what Eastern Europe was like 6 months ago and now what it's like today. So just having that structure sometimes when you're doing a briefing, how do you organize your thoughts on your material, saved the day for me, and I've ever been grateful to Gene. The discussion there with President Bush was not just us. There were people from the State Department who were talking to him. This was prior to his meeting with Gorbachev in December in Malta, the Malta Summit, on heaving ships in the harbor during a storm. But that summit was important because afterward, you can look this up and find the exact wording, but he and Gorbachev gave a little press conference in which essentially they said the Cold War is over. I don't know that they used exactly those words, but everyone interpreted it as, okay, Cold War is over. So that's December of 1989. The Soviet Union has not yet fallen. Although poor Gorbachev was about less than a year away from a coup attempt on him. What I remember, and I don't know, people remember this differently, but what I remember, and I think what the analyst who was there remembers with me, is at one point Bush said to us, well, will the wall fall? We weren't yet seeing the breaches that everyone has talked about. And I remember our answer being, for all practical purposes, it's gone. And what we meant was the trends, the pressures on both sides of the wall are such that it cannot be sustained. So I don't portray that as some evidence of brilliant prescience. It was really pretty obvious to us, but it was just a moment in time in which he was trying to figure out, again, as John said, he was trying to figure out how do you deal with Gorbachev, and he was very much of the mind that he didn't want to do high fives about any of this if it came about. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you.
That's all you should. It's great.
John?
As a footnote to that, first of all, on the Berlin Wall, you know, by the time the wall fell, we had already had 250,000 East Germans had come through Germany. So it was,
right.
We all talked about it as an anachronism. But I will tell you, and I know I think it's Brian Quigley and others have talked about how they mentioned this to President Bush. When I look back on it, it was kind of a no-brainer that the wall was an anachronism. But I think it was 2 days before the wall came down that I was at the German embassy here in town, and the number 2 in the embassy and I were in a conversation, and I said the Economist magazine has just done a short one of those pithy articles they write, shows how the wall is going to come down, and they described it though it would come down before 2000, but it was describing it exactly the way it happened. And then I turned to my German interlocutor and he said, yes, I did read the article, but probably not in my lifetime. So that, you know, there was this uncertainty out there, and I do remember a little confab that you and I had in our office with some of our best analysts, those who knew the most about the 4-power status, and they kind of looked at us when we talked about, you know, stuff's going on. People are watching television. You know, look what's happening in the rest of the region. This could collapse any time, and we got to be ready for it. And what we got was kind of a professorial. So you don't
quite understand.
You, our bosses, don't quite understand how complicated this is, and the force of those laws. And this is East Germany, the linchpin of Soviet security in Europe. So, you know, hold back your enthusiasm. And it was, but we were all surprised at the way it happened. But then Gunter Schabowski, helped us with almost keystone cop routine that brought the wall down. And by the way, one of the things I'll say about East Germany is that Schabowski and Egon Krenz, who were the kind of they helped to get rid of Honecker, but they ended up in jail. And I think Schabowski got out after a year, but Egon Krenz, I think, he spent the full 6 years in jail because the people of East Germany were so, they weren't just against, they were against communism. I mean, and not just the leaders, but they wanted the leaders to pay for what they had done. The last point I want to make is on CSI, it's the Center for Studies of Intelligence. I've been teaching at Georgetown for 14 years, and if you look at my syllabus, it's loaded with CSI input. And that's because there are people who have worked at CSI, like Hal Ford, who was one of my personal heroes, who was able to take that full experience of our support for policymakers and also look back on it with a very critical eye. And I think that's very important for intelligence to do, because we are dealing with uncertainty. We do the best we can. We bring the best information we can to the table. But in the end, as truth emerges, we're not always telling it to the parliament. We're doing the best we can. And to look back the way he did, I think is enlightening, and it shows a humility, I think, that is very important in the work that we do. But we also, the final point I make is that in terms of analytic support, we did a lot of embedding of analysts in State Department, traveling. I remember Bob Fraser, when he was working the Balkans, he would take Norm Schindler with him. And I can understand why, because Schindler was the answer man, and almost the right answer man on so many issues. The policymakers particularly enjoyed, and I remember by Toby Gotti's emphasis on getting out more help for the diplomats and getting us engaged more. Both John and I agreed that old doctrine that intelligence should be separated from policy because you'll be polluted or corrupted if you deal directly with policymakers was absolutely bad doctrine. The closer we got, the more engaged, the more we understood what policymakers needed to know, the better became our support and our engagement with that policy community. But loads of embedment, and I remember so many times. Tony Lake was a perfect example. It was at the end of a National Security Council meeting, he'd say, "Well, you know, I know what you guys say and what you can't say, but what do you really think?" And and by the way, there was a doctrine that would have said, I should say, "Well, my view doesn't matter because I only represent the agency," and I quickly dispensed with that as a matter of survival, because what policymakers are looking for is they need sounding boards to back and forth, and intelligence analysts who are working these issues day to day could be very helpful. So the more we get the analysts in front of the policymakers and engaged with them, the better it was for both sides of that effort.
Thank you. Yes, Constanze, did you have?
Oh, I just wanted to say that Egon Krenz is still alive and defiantly unrepentant.
He gave an interview fairly recently
Right.
that someone in the audience alerted me to.
Right. So let's take two final questions, Dieter and Charles. Over there.
Thank you very much. It's extremely interesting.
Introduce yourself,
Dieter
please.
Detke, Georgetown University, and I was head of the Ebert Foundation here in Washington when the wall fell, and I had some explaining to do. But first thing I want to say is what a great success of statecraft the process was, looking back 30 years. And it is just amazing. And I don't know any other example in history with that amount of complexity to manage this process so successfully. That's enormous and unheard of. But my question is more precisely about German unification, because what was it that enabled the CIA to see unification coming so much earlier than German authorities? I was in a meeting with Vernon Walters I think it was in April '89, with Walter Momper. And Vernon Walters explained to us that unification is coming sooner than later. And of course, Momper almost fell off the chair. But what was it that enabled you all to predict so precisely unification? That's my point.
Okay.
Do you have better sources than the West Germans? Did you not share your knowledge with the West Germans? Because that's a little bit unexplained.
Thank you. All right. And Charles. And that's got to beat, unfortunately.
Charles Gotti, Johns Hopkins University. I have a tiny story to add to the many other anecdotes and stories about how difficult it was to anticipate events in that incredible situation that nobody had anticipated. I wrote an article in December of 1988 for Foreign Affairs. And during the writing process, Gorbachev came to the UN and gave me the courage of my conviction about Eastern Europe when he said that he would withdraw whatever it was, 50,000 troops from the region. So I submitted the article to Foreign Affairs in New York, and Peter Gross, who was the managing editor, read it, and he said he liked it a lot, and he said he thought that his editor, Bill Hyland, also liked it very much, but he had a question about the title of the article. The title, as I gave it, was Eastern Europe on Its Own. That's how it appeared, by the way, in the January 1989 issue of Foreign Affairs. And the question had to do with a question mark after that. I put a question mark there because I was so worried about whether I will turn out to be right about semi-independence coming to Eastern Europe. And so my wife read the draft. You had referred to her, John, Toby Gotti. And she has had far more courage than I did. And she says, take out that question mark, Eastern Europe on its own. Why not like that? And so I walked into the editorial offices of Foreign Affairs, and it turned out that Bill Hyland had exactly the same point. And so he said, we're going to take that question mark down. So last week I reread the article because of this conference here. And I look a lot more brave than I actually was.
Thank you, Charles.
Could I just say, Charles, I talked about how our analysts were helpful to policymakers. I would want to say that you were very helpful to our analysts, and the conversations about Hungary and that back and forth was very important, I think, to getting us on the right track. So thank you.
I do want to give everyone a chance to respond, especially also to Dieter's. That gives.
I don't want to, in responding to Dieter, I don't want to leave the impression that we were perfectly prescient. You know, I don't know that we said a year ahead of time on such and such a date Germany will be united. What we were seeing were the trends that clearly once I referred to the demise politically of Kadar in Hungary 18 months before the wall came down. So there were all of these trends surrounding Germany that were more dramatic and apparent than those within East Germany, at least to me. But the pressures were building. The demonstration effect was there. So that, and then John alluded to an important point, which is if you looked at those in our realm where we worked who were most steeped in Germany, who spoke the language, who had studied there, they didn't necessarily see it coming. It was analysts who hadn't worked on it their entire lives, who were fairly fresh to it, and I could name a couple, I won't, but I could name a couple who were really personal heroes, who were among those who said, you know, this cannot be sustained. And so, and they were, I think, the most influential in our group, particularly with the leadership, John and myself and others, in persuading us that this was the message we should be giving. You know, much could be said about along the same lines about the collapse of the Soviet Union, which people often say the CIA missed. It didn't really miss it. When you look at the declassified documents, it's apparent we saw those trends building. I wasn't working on that then, but I take my hat off to people like George Colt, a famous analyst of Soviet affairs who wrote papers in 1989, 90, one of them called The Soviet Cauldron. I believe it's been declassified, which clearly, and again, in the office he headed, which was called SOVA, basically Soviet Union, George created a republics division, kind of anticipating that we're going to be dealing with more than just one big country here. So there was just an abiding sense throughout the portion of the agency that worked on that part of the world that things were changing. And also, as a general comment on analysis, it really helps to have distance from the problem. I used to think this when I was an analyst, and on those rare occasions when I would get something right, I would realize it's because I'm way up here looking down at all of these pieces on a board being moved around, and the pieces themselves, I'm talking about leaders in countries, couldn't quite see what we could see because they were caught up in it. And yet if you were watching from up, from a distance, not literally in imagery from space, but mentally from a distance, you could sometimes detect trends that couldn't be seen up close. So I think that's, maybe John wants to add something to that, but that's kind of how I remember it.
What I recall is certainly our analysts saw the German unification issue coming very rapidly after. As an issue, it was going to have to be dealt with, and it was going to be inevitable we would have to deal with it. But as I recall, that when the wall came down, I think Gorbachev was in bed, and I don't think he was told until the next day, and his first reaction was surprisingly cool. But then, as the day went on, he began to panic about what the consequences were for having lost this very important symbol of Soviet security in Europe. But when he was asked would he want to speak to any of the German leadership, he preferred to talk to Helmut Kohl and to George H.W. Bush. That's where, and the reason I think he wanted to do that was because he wanted reassurances that they wouldn't now push the issue of German unification, and they would contain it. And then, of course, we also had Margaret Thatcher, who remembered the Blitzkrieg, and she was really waving her handbag about that. She was very upset about the whole idea that we would proceed rapidly. And then François Mitterrand, who saw his ambitions to lead a powerful European Union really being lost by the idea that Germany would come, a unified Germany would come with its economy and actually eclipse a French influence. So there were a lot of reasons to slow it down. And I think that at a policy level, it was slowed down until I think the dialogue between East and West and Helmut Kohl decided we've got a window of opportunity here, and with all the debate within Germany and beyond, we're going to go ahead with it. And George H.W. Bush bought into that wholly, and then we moved forward with it. But at the time that the wall went down, it was, again, in my judgment, almost we thought it as a no-brainer that if the wall is gone and we're going to have free movement of Germans across the borders, then isn't German unification the next step in the way? Politically, so as an idea, it was very powerful, but as a political reality, it was going to take a lot more time to cut through those more complex issues with the Soviet Union, with Gorbachev, who was concerned about his own position, which was growing increasingly weak within his own country, and then the other European powers who just didn't see this as such a great idea.
John, a quick...
Yeah, just, I would say we didn't view the fall of the wall as a discrete event. We viewed it as the beginning collapse of an empire. So at the time, we thought of it that way, that this was the Soviet empire. And the last time empires had collapsed on that scale was after World War I, Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman. And we're still dealing with the problems out of that. Remember, Iraq was created in the aftermath of World War I, as was Yugoslavia and the boundaries of Czechoslovakia as they existed in 1989. And so I think you lay then the rubble of the Soviet collapse on top of that, and I could go on, but I think we are still dealing with the collapse of empire. When the empires collapse, it takes decades for the dust to settle. The problems in Ukraine and Georgia, this is from the collapse of an empire. And we're still dealing with the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapse, believe it or not. So
thank you.
That's why this is such an ongoing issue for the intelligence world to think about.
Thank you. Mark, any final
just
thoughts?
a quick word is on the German unification issue. I went to Soviet Union in early 1989. I think it was in March of 1989, and I was able to meet with quite senior officials like Valery Musatov, who was then the first deputy head of the Communist Party's international department, and he was also an expert on Germany, and he assured me confidently that Germany would never be unified. By contrast, though, I remember I had a meeting with Vyacheslav Dashichev, who was not an official in the Communist Party. He was an academic. He was at the Institute of Balkan, what was then called Balkan Studies and Balkan and Slavonic Studies. It's now just called the Institute of Slavonic Studies, and he said that Germany would be reunified within 3 years. And again, he didn't miss that by much. He had a feel for it in a way that Musatov, who was an expert on Germany and dealt with that professionally for the Communist Party, simply did not. And you could point to any number of other officials, including Erich Honecker himself, who at the beginning of 1989 predicted that the wall would last for another 1,000 years. So prognostication is sometimes a dangerous thing to engage in. The last thing would be, one thing that Constanza mentioned was Viktor Orban. And in mid-June 1989, when Imre Nagy was reburied in Budapest, and there were several 100,000 people who went. And by far the most fiery speech there was by Viktor Orban, which makes it especially ironic that he nowadays, over the last 10 years in particular, has stood contrary to most of the things that he seemed to be espousing back then.
Thank you. Constanze?
The last point on which relates to my final warning about, shall we say, negative determinism, which is that in Warsaw and in Budapest and elsewhere, we now have mayors who very clearly are at odds with Viktor Orban and with peace, and who
peace meaning the
PiS,
Law and Justice
Polish
Party,
government,
the
yes,
ruling
exactly,
party
yes.
in Poland.
Not peace as in world peace.
Prawo
And I think that there are clearly stirrings of civil society which are not just, I don't think that these are just sort of some tenuous grass shoots. There is clearly something going on there which suggests that there may be another cycle of history coming. So to me, that's good news because I, by now, have lots of friends in those countries, and I hope that they got what they wished for.
Amen.
Yeah,
Thank you. The German in me gets very nervous when we run over the agreed time. 10 minutes now, or 12 almost. It speaks to the richness of this wonderful panel. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you to Deputy Director Rapp and the CIA's Public Affairs Office for the cooperation on this event. We're looking forward to more document releases to come.
Declassification.
Thank you all for joining us, for sharing your insights. We're adjourned. Let's give a round of applause to the panelists.
I told you, I really